Welcome, weary travelers of the night, to another tale spun especially for those minds that refuse to quiet down when the world demands rest. If you find a moment of peculiar calm in our strange stories, perhaps consider subscribing to At Hollow Midnight, where the mundane often becomes the most unexpectedly thrilling. Tonight we delve into Chapter 1, The Peasant's Peaceful Plan. Elara was, by all accounts, a remarkably unremarkable man. His days were a monotonous rhythm of tilling, sowing, and harvesting, his evenings a quiet procession of coarse bread and watery ale. His greatest ambition had always been a particularly deep and uninterrupted sleep on a Sunday afternoon, a luxury rarely afforded to those whose lives were dictated by the sun and the soil. Yet, as the whispers of the Black Death began to creep through the village of Oakhaven, not unlike the insidious fog that sometimes rolled in from the nearby fen, Elara found himself contemplating a grander, far more ambitious period of repose. The plague, he reasoned with the simplistic logic of a man unburdened by excessive formal education, was a thing of action. It stalked, it consumed, it ravaged. What, then, was the antithesis of action? Inaction. And what was the epitome of inaction? Sleep, oh guide. A deep, profound, all-encompassing slumber. If he could simply, truly, thoroughly, sleep through the entire unpleasantness, he would emerge on the other side, blinking in the sunlight, perhaps a little stiff, but utterly untouched. The thought, he believed, was nothing short of genius. Others might panic, might flee, might pray, might brew noxious concoctions from questionable herbs, but Elara? Elara would simply wait it out, nestled safely within the comforting oblivion of unconsciousness. His preparations were meticulous for a peasant. First, he gathered every scrap of food he possessed: a stale crust of bread, a few wizened apples, a small hard wedge of cheese that smelled faintly of goat. These, he decided, were sufficient for the first day or two of his waking period, should his slumber prove less eternal than hope. Then, water. He filled his largest wooden bucket from the village well, dragging it back to his humble single-room cottage, its wattle and daub walls offering little insulation from the world, but a great deal of comfort in their familiarity. Next, his bed. It was naught but a straw palliasse laid upon the packed earth floor, covered by a thin, patched wool blanket. He fluffed the straw with an earnestness usually reserved for the spring plowing, punching it into a surprisingly soft mound. He even went so far as to gather some fresh hay from his small patch, carefully layering it beneath the old straw for a touch of unprecedented luxury. The scent of dried grass filled the room, a surprisingly pleasant aroma that, for a fleeting moment, made him feel almost pampered. The day he chose for the commencement of his great sleep was a Tuesday, largely because Tuesday felt less significant than a Monday or a Friday, and thus less likely to be disturbed. The sun hung low and hazy in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters. A distant, muffled cough echoed from somewhere down the lane, a sound that in recent days had taken on a new, chilling resonance. But Elara merely pulled his thin blanket higher. "Sleep," he mumbled to himself, tucking his rough hands beneath his cheek. "It is the ultimate shield." He closed his eyes with a sigh of immense satisfaction, the sort of sigh usually reserved for the last bite of a particularly fine meal, or the first sip of cool water on a sweltering day. He imagined himself sinking, not into the straw, but into a deep, dark pool of serene emptiness, waiting for the current of the plague to simply flow past him, leaving him untroubled on the far bank. For a few precious minutes the plan seemed to be working. His mind, usually a chaotic jumble of crop yields and patched boots, began to quiet. The earthy smell of the straw, combined with the faint comforting scent of his own unwashed self, was a familiar lullaby. He felt the tension begin to drain from his shoulders, the small aches and pains of a day's labor gently receding. He mused, a genius. A simple genius, perhaps, but a genius nonetheless. Then came the first intrusion. It was subtle, barely a whisper on the edge of his perception. The distant, mournful baying of a dog. Not his dog, for he had no dog, but a village cur, one of those scrawny, omnipresent creatures that haunted the periphery of every cottage. Normally, Elara would have registered it as little more than background noise, part of the fabric of Oakhaven's existence. But now, straining for the silence that would herald true sleep, it snagged his attention like a burr on a wool tunic. The dog's howl seemed laced with an unfamiliar sorrow, a plaint that spoke not of hunger or loneliness, but of something deeper, more primal. Perhaps even a premonition of widespread suffering. Elara grumbled, shifting his weight, trying to dismiss it as a mere fleeting annoyance. He pulled the blanket tighter over his ears, effectively muffling the sound. Yet the lingering resonance of its sadness seemed to vibrate within the very straw of his bed. Next, the wind picked up. It wasn't a fierce, storm-bringing gale, but a persistent, almost irritating breeze that found every crack and crevice in his poorly constructed cottage. It whistled through the gaps in the wattle, a low, reedy moan that sounded suspiciously like a whisper. Elara swore he could hear individual dried leaves skittering across his thatched roof, each scratchy rustle amplified in the newfound quiet of his self-imposed isolation. He curled into a tighter ball, pulling his knees towards his chest, an instinctual effort to make himself smaller, less accessible to the world outside. The wind seemed to mock his attempts at stillness, its invisible fingers prodding and poking, demanding his attention. His stomach then chose that moment to rumble, a surprisingly loud and uncooperative protest against his grand scheme. He had eaten a frugal meal earlier, mostly thin porridge, and his body, accustomed to a peasant's perpetual state of mild hunger, was reminding him of its needs. Elara sighed deeply, a long, drawn-out exhalation that deflated his carefully constructed cocoon of peace. He clenched his jaw, willing the internal cacophony to cease. This was not part of the plan. The plan involved blissful, uninterrupted oblivion, not the internal machinations of a discontented gut. Then, a new sound, closer and far more distinct. The unmistakable creak of his neighbor, old Master Thomas, opening his cottage door. Thomas was a man of routine, and this was an unusual time for him to be stirring. A low murmur of voices followed, hushed and urgent, too quiet to decipher, but loud enough to pierce the fragile veil of Elara's intended slumber. He heard the shuffle of feet on the muddy path outside, then the distinct clatter of something heavy being dragged, followed by a series of low, guttural coughs that ended in a distressing wheeze. Elara's eyes, which he had so resolutely kept shut, now twitched beneath their lids. He imagined Thomas, always frail, now struggling, perhaps with a burden too heavy for his aged frame. Was it firewood? Or something else? The thought, unbidden and unwelcome, pricked at his carefully cultivated detachment. A bell. Not the joyous peal of the Sunday church bell, but the slow, deliberate, mournful clang of the death knell. And 1, 2, 3. Each toll reverberated through the very timbers of his cottage, through the packed earth beneath his straw mattress, through the bones in his body. It was a sound that had become increasingly common in Oakhaven over the past few weeks, a steady grim punctuation mark in the village's dwindling life. Today, however, it seemed particularly insistent, each reverberation stretching out, refusing to fade, demanding to be acknowledged. Elara counted them, against his will, a morbid tally of the fallen. He lost count somewhere around the 9th or 10th peal, his mind refusing to focus on such a grim arithmetic. The sound continued, a relentless, somber rhythm, each clang a hammer blow to his peaceful intention. He tried to focus on his breathing, on the simple rhythm of inhale and exhale, as his mother had taught him when he was a frightened child in a thunderstorm. but his breath seemed to catch in his throat, each inhale too shallow, each exhale too forced. The air in the cottage, once pleasantly earthy, now seemed thick with the sense of the outside world, the acrid smell of burning herbs, an attempt by some villagers to ward off the pestilence, mingled with something far less pleasant, a faint, sickly sweet aroma that clung to the air, a scent that spoke of decay, of things left unattended for too long. Ilara instinctively pulled his thin blanket over his nose and mouth, as if a layer of coarse wool could protect him from the insidious odor of mortality. A mouse, emboldened by the dim light and the cottage's stillness, scurried across the floorboards near his head, its tiny claws a surprisingly loud scratching against the wood. Ilara flinched, pulling his head further into the straw, a small, involuntary shiver running down his spine. The thought of a plague-ridden mouse, or perhaps a flea-ridden one, suddenly skittering over his exposed skin was enough to send a cold dread through him. He imagined it, tiny claws finding purchase on his cheek, a ticklish horror that made his skin crawl. The light outside began to fade, but not into the comforting embrace of night. Instead, it grew dim with a heavy, bruised purple hue, signaling the approach of a storm. Soon the first fat drops of rain splattered against his thatched roof, a gentle drumming that quickly intensified into a steady, pounding rhythm. The wind picked up again, howling through the chimney, rattling the loose wooden shutter of his small window. The rain hammered against the outside walls, turning the muddy path outside into a churning river, carrying with it who knew what unseen horrors. His simple cottage, which had felt like a fortress just an hour ago, now seemed flimsy, permeable, utterly exposed to the relentless assault of the elements, and, by extension, the world's misery. Ilara's eyes snapped open. He was not asleep. He was wide awake, more awake than he had been in days. His senses heightened, his mind a frantic, buzzing hive of unwanted thoughts and sensory input. The profound, all-encompassing slumber he had so carefully planned had utterly eluded him. His straw palliasse felt lumpy, the straw beneath his head poky, his blanket thin and inadequate. The cottage, once a haven, now felt like a cage, trapping him with the overwhelming reality of his failure. The quiet peace he had sought had been rudely, relentlessly interrupted by the undeniable, unyielding presence of the very world he had tried to shut out. He lay there, staring at the darkened ceiling, listening to the incessant rain, the distant mournful bell, the faint sickening scent of the village, and felt, with a profound and bitter clarity, the utter futility of trying to sleep through a plague. Chapter 2. A plague arrives uninvited. Ilara lay there, staring at the darkened ceiling. The rain hammered down, a relentless, monotonous drumbeat against the thatch, and the distant, mournful clang of the death knell continued its slow, grim rhythm. His eyes, though open, saw nothing but the oppressive blackness of his own failure. He had tried to outwit the inevitable, to cheat death by simply not being present for its visit, and the universe, in its infinite, subtle cruelty, had responded not with outright denial, but with relentless, insidious interruption. Every sound, every smell, every tiny internal bodily function had conspired against his grand design of oblivion. He felt the prickle of the straw against his cheek, the stiff ache in his lower back, the incessant gnawing demand of his empty stomach. The air, thick with the dampness of the rain and the faint, unsettling scent of decay that seemed to cling to the very fabric of Oakhaven now, pressed in on him. His mind, instead of quieting, spun with a furious, futile energy, replaying every failed attempt to find stillness. Every imagined scenario of blissful slumber now dashed against the harsh rocks of reality. He was exhausted, profoundly and utterly exhausted, not just physically from the day's labor, but mentally from the sheer Sisyphean effort of trying to force a state of non-existence. He squeezed his eyes shut again, not in renewed hope, but in a desperate, Last-ditch attempt to simply stop seeing, stop hearing, stop feeling. The sheer, unadulterated futility of his situation was a heavy blanket, far thicker and more suffocating than his thin wool coverlet. It pressed down on him, crushing his will, stealing his fight. And so, with a final desperate sigh that tasted of resignation and defeat, his conscious mind, paradoxically, gave up the ghost. It wasn't a peaceful descent into slumber, not the gentle drift he had envisioned. It was more akin to a sudden involuntary collapse, a mental blackout born of utter, overwhelming fatigue. One moment he was agonizingly, miserably awake, every nerve screaming in protest. The next he was simply gone. His snores began then, surprisingly robust for a man of his lean frame, a low rumbling vibrato that rattled the very dust from the rafters. They were not the gentle, contented murmurs of a man at peace, but the deep, guttural exhalations of someone utterly unconscious, felled by a profound exhaustion that bordered on stupor. Outside, the rain continued its assault, but the storm was evolving, reaching a crescendo of wind and driving water that made the village seem to groan under its weight. The death knell, which had been a steady, mournful rhythm, now began to accelerate, its clangs coming faster, more frantic, signaling not just individual departures, but a burgeoning crisis. A distant cry, thin and reedy, pierced the din, followed by another. Closer this time, a woman's shriek, sharp with terror and pain. Then, the rhythmic pounding of a door, insistent and desperate, followed by the splintering crack of wood, giving way. Elara, however, was blissfully oblivious. His breath hitched, a gurgle in his throat, and then settled back into its rhythmic snort. As the pre-dawn hours bled into a bruised, overcast morning, Oakhaven was not awakening to the gentle clatter of daily life, but to a symphony of distress. The first truly undeniable signs of the plague had arrived, not in a creeping whisper, but with the brutal suddenness of a fist to the gut. Old Master Thomas, whose cough Elara had heard the night before, had been found this very morning, slumped against his own doorframe, his skin already taking on an unnatural purplish hue around the neck and armpits, his breath rattling like dry leaves in a gale. His wife Agnes, usually a woman of stoic silence, had erupted into a wail that tore through the still damp air, a sound so raw and filled with primal grief that it surely should have woken the dead, let alone a peasant attempting to sleep through an apocalypse. Yet, Elara remained prone on his straw, a bastion of unconsciousness, his nasal symphony continuing unabated. The commotion around Thomas's cottage grew. Voices, once hushed and fearful, now rose in a cacophony of panicked exclamations. "The spots!" someone cried, their voice laced with a mixture of terror and revulsion. "He has the black spots." Another voice, deeper, more authoritative, presumably that of the village elder, called for caution, for distance, for the immediate sealing of the cottage. But fear, once unleashed, rarely heeds the call of reason. The villagers, normally slow to action, now moved with a frantic, uncoordinated energy. Doors slammed, children cried, dogs barked in a hysterical chorus. Someone began frantically ringing the church bell again, not with the measured tolls of death, but with an almost manic, desperate clangor, as if volume alone could ward off the unseen enemy. The sound? A frantic jangle of brass, sliced through the morning air. It was a chaotic, discordant symphony of burgeoning dread, a soundtrack to the swift unraveling of Oakhaven's precarious peace. Elara, meanwhile, simply rolled onto his side, his arm flung out, his face buried deeper into the prickly straw. A particularly loud shriek from a young woman near Thomas's cottage, who had just discovered her own child feverish and unresponsive, might have caused a slight tremor in Elara's eyelid, but his breathing remained deep and even. He dreamt, perhaps, of a particularly successful harvest, or a perfectly ripe turnip, or maybe nothing at all. Merely a void of blissful, well-earned emptiness. The pungent smell of burning herbs, once a faint background note, now intensified as desperate villagers lit fires of rosemary, thyme, and whatever else they believed might purify the air. The acrid smoke stinging eyes and throats, but doing little to dispel the rising tide of fear. The smoke wafted into Elara's cottage through the gaps in the wattle, mingling with the earthy scent of straw and the faint, sickly sweet aroma of fear and illness that seemed to seep into the very foundations of the village. His nose, however, seemed to have taken a sabbatical from its duties, registering nothing more than the gentle warmth of his own exhaled breath. The village street outside Elara's cottage, usually teeming with the first stirrings of dawn activity, a farmer leading his ox to pasture, a woman fetching water from the well, children already chasing chickens, was now a scene of bewildered disarray. Some families had barricaded their doors, hoping to seal themselves off from the encroaching horror. Others, in a fit of desperate flight, were gathering what meager possessions they could, preparing to abandon their homes and history, hoping to outrun the invisible enemy. There were arguments, harsh and terrified, as neighbors turned on neighbors, suspicion blooming in the fertile ground of panic. A dog, one of the same scrawny curs Elara had heard the night before, now whimpered forlornly outside his own door, its tail tucked low, its normally keen senses overwhelmed by the human fear radiating from every direction. It scratched lightly at Elara's door, a small, hopeful gesture for comfort or attention, but received no response. Inside, Elara snored on, a bastion of monumental indifference, a monument to the power of a truly determined nap. The sound of wagons, rarely heard before midday, now creaked and rumbled down the lane. Not the familiar wagons laden with harvest goods, but wagons bearing the sick, the dead, or the fleeing. The wheels churned through the mud, a heavy, dragging sound that spoke of burdens beyond mere weight. A child's insistent hacking cough close by, followed by the distressed shushing of a parent, briefly cut through the general din, a poignant, terrifying reminder of the plague's indiscriminate reach. The village seemed to be shrinking, contracting in on itself, as if attempting to escape its own terrible reality. Yet, within the quiet confines of Elara's cottage, a different reality entirely held sway. He was neither contracting nor expanding, merely existing in a profound state of suspended animation. A human chrysalis oblivious to the frantic metamorphosis occurring just beyond his wattle walls. One particular sound, a guttural retching followed by a splash, occurred just outside his window. It was the sound of someone violently ill, expelling the contents of their stomach, likely one of the first victims whose body was already revolting against the insidious invasion. The smell, though faint, was unmistakable, sour, acrid, utterly vile. Even through the thin wattle, a particularly potent gust of wind could have carried it in. But Elara's nose, in its profound slumber, remained resolutely closed for business. He was, in this moment, perhaps the only truly unbothered soul in Oakhaven. His plan, for all its initial flaws and his waking frustrations, had by some bizarre turn of events paradoxically succeeded in its ultimate goal. He was profoundly, undeniably, spectacularly unaware of the horrors unfolding around him. The village was erupting in cries of despair, in frantic prayers, in the bewildered sorrow of sudden loss. But Elara remained in his private dark theater, where the curtain had fallen completely on the macabre play unfolding outside. The sun, having made a half-hearted attempt to break through the clouds, now retreated behind a heavy gray shroud, casting the village in a perpetual twilight, a fitting stage for the unfolding tragedy. The first official communal action taken by the village elders, a desperate last-ditch effort, was announced by the shrill blowing of a horn, a sound usually reserved for warning of approaching raiders. Now it signaled a new, unseen enemy. "The well is poisoned," a voice amplified by fear bellowed across the square. "No one drink from the well. Use the spring up the hill." This was a lie, a desperate attempt to explain the inexplicable, to attribute the plague to a known source. to give the terrified populace something tangible to fight. But the lie, like the fear, spread rapidly. People panicked, stampeding towards the single, narrow path leading to the distant spring, jostling, pushing, fear stripping away their usual civility. The sounds of their desperate rush, the cries, the hurried footsteps, the frantic breath, filtered into Ilara's cottage, muted by the walls, but still a distant, restless hum of human desperation. Yet Ilara merely shifted, his cheek pressing more firmly into the yielding straw, his sleep a deep, unshakable ocean. The tide of panic washed over Oakhaven, cresting and crashing, but Ilara remained beneath the waves, a silent, oblivious sentinel of profound, unintentional peace. His dream, if one could call it that, was of nothing in particular, merely a vast, formless expanse of soothing dark. There were no worries of crop blight, no anxieties over overdue rent, no nagging thoughts of his perpetually leaky roof. It was the sort of dreamless sleep that truly refreshed, or would if one were not attempting to sleep through a global pandemic. His body, left to its own devices, had finally achieved the deep, restorative state his conscious mind had so desperately craved and so singularly failed to achieve. He was a perfect vacuum of awareness, absorbing nothing, reflecting nothing. The village outside could burn, could fall silent, could descend into a hellish frenzy, and Ilara would be none the wiser. His snore, a steady, unwavering testament to his profound detachment, was the only sound that truly mattered within the confines of his humble cottage. He was an island of unconsciousness in a sea of escalating terror. A man who, by accident and then by sheer, pig-headed exhaustion, had managed to achieve a brief, fleeting moment of absolute, horrifyingly ignorant serenity. The initial panic of Oakhaven was, to Ilara, merely the subtle background hum of a world that was politely waiting for him to awaken, completely oblivious that its entire social fabric was rending itself into chaotic tatters. He continued to snore, a tiny, self-contained universe of blissful oblivion, while the plague began its grim, relentless work, sweeping through the village like an unseen reaper, gathering souls with chilling efficiency, each loss marked by a new scream, a fresh toll of the bell, or a quiet, heartbreaking silence that Ilara never heard. The morning advanced, and the village of Oakhaven, once a sleepy, predictable place, transformed into a theater of rapidly escalating horrors, all playing out on the periphery of Ilara's spectacularly deep, stubbornly unyielding sleep. Chapter 3. The neighbor who wouldn't stop coughing. Ilara's deep, profound sleep, that accidental triumph of exhaustion over dread, was not destined to last forever. It was not the relentless, mournful tolling of the death knell, which had punctuated the pre-dawn hours with its somber rhythm, that managed to breach his hard-won oblivion. Nor was it the distant, frantic shrieks of panic that had erupted from the village square, nor even the unsettling rumble of wagons carrying silent burdens that traversed the muddy lane. No, the first true assault on Ilara's fortress of unconsciousness came in a form far more mundane, far more insidious, and infinitely more irritating: a cough. It began subtly, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the very fabric of the wattle and daub wall that separated his humble cottage from that of his closest neighbor, Old Man Hemlock. At first, Ilara's subconscious dismissed it, weaving it into the already chaotic tapestry of his fading dreams. It was merely the rustle of dry leaves on his thatched roof, perhaps, or the familiar groan of his old cottage timbers settling, a sound so common it barely registered. But then it came again, a bit stronger this time, a low, guttural expulsion of air that seemed to vibrate through the very packed earth beneath his straw palliasse. And again, and again. It was not a polite, clearing of the throat sort of cough, nor the mild, phlegmy hack of an old man with a touch of winter chill. This was a deep, wet, racking cough, a sound born from the very depths of lungs convulsing, rich with the sound of struggle, and the promise of something truly unpleasant. Old Man Hemlock, even in the best of times, had been a man of perpetual wheezes and occasional expectorations, a fact Ilara had long ago relegated to the background noise of village life. So for a time, Ilara's still slumbering mind simply categorized it as Hemlock being Hemlock, an unfortunate but dismissible aspect of his daily auditory landscape. His sleep, though deep, was a precarious peace, built on the shifting sands of utter, all-consuming fatigue, and it was ill-equipped to withstand such a persistent internal assault. But the cough from Hemlock's cottage, like a relentless drip from a leaky roof, was not constant in its mundane familiarity. It escalated. What started as an infrequent distant rumble became more frequent, more violent, more desperate. It transformed from a general background nuisance into a focused, targeted assault on Ilara's cherished oblivion. Each hack seemed to scrape at his very consciousness, a rasping, wet sound that painted vivid, unwelcome pictures in the half-formed landscape of his fading dreams. He found himself, even in the depths of his stupor, trying to shift away from the sound, burrowing deeper into the straw, pulling the thin blanket further over his head, as if his meager bedding could form an impenetrable barrier against the sonic onslaught. His brain, even in its profound state of rest, began to subtly register the unnatural quality of the sound. It was no longer the routine complaint of an old man's lungs. It held a new, sinister resonance, a note of frantic struggle, of a body fighting against something powerful and overwhelming. The sound carried with it an unsettling dampness, as if the very air itself had been coughed out from a diseased lung. The rhythm of the cough became a torment. It would build a crescendo of wet, choking gasps, each one tearing, rasping, then followed by a momentary, terrifying silence, as if Hemlock had finally succumbed, only to erupt again with renewed, desperate vigor. This pattern, the sudden cessation followed by the violent return, was particularly effective in jarring Ilara's subconscious. His muscles would tense. His breathing would briefly hitch, even in his sleep, a subtle, involuntary response to the escalating auditory drama next door. He began to sweat, a cold dampness that clung to his back, not from heat but from the vague, formless anxiety that the relentless sound was now generating within him. His body, even if his mind remained largely shut down, was starting to react, a slow, unwilling awakening of his sensory organs. The straw beneath him, which had initially felt soft and inviting, now seemed to prickle and poke. The air, once merely damp and earthy, now seemed heavy, thick, somehow imbued with the struggling, desperate quality of Hemlock's strained breaths. He tried to turn his head away, to press his ear into the yielding straw, hoping to dampen the sound, to re-establish the comforting quiet he had so desperately sought. But the sound seemed to resonate through the very earth, through the thin wattle and daub wall that separated his cottage from Hemlock's. It was as if the cough had gained sentience, deliberately seeking him out, intent on dismantling his carefully constructed fortress of unawareness. He could almost feel the vibrations of it in his chest, a sympathetic tremor that echoed Hemlock's desperate struggle. A new element joined the cough, a low, whimpering groan that punctuated the hacking, a sound of profound distress, not unlike that of an animal caught in a snare. This was not the familiar grumpy grumble of Old Man Hemlock complaining about his rheumatism, or the price of oats. This was the raw sound of suffering, undeniably close, terrifyingly intimate. It grated on Ilara's already frayed nerves, even in his semi-conscious state. He wanted, with an intensity that surprised even his dreaming self, for it to simply cease. His eyelids began to twitch, tiny, involuntary spasms as his mind fought a losing battle against the encroaching reality. The darkness behind his eyes, once a vast and soothing void, now seemed to ripple with distorted images, vague, shadowy shapes that pulsed with the rhythm of the cough, like a distorted, macabre heartbeat. He could vaguely recall his earlier frustration from the day before, the myriad interruptions that had prevented his initial descent into sleep. Now, that same sense of annoyance, but magnified and imbued with a nascent dread, began to prickle at the edges of his fading unconsciousness. He dreamt now, not of pigs or turnips, but of a monstrous invisible hand, squeezing, clutching, refusing to let him rest, its grip tightening with each rasping expulsion of air from next door. The air in his cottage, to which his profound sleep had made him immune, now began to register faintly in his nasal passages. It was not just the general dampness, but a subtle coppery tang, mingled with the cloying sweetness of stale sickness, a scent that hinted at an unwellness beyond mere seasonal ailment. The cough grew fiercer still. It was a prolonged paroxysm, a seemingly endless volley of hacks and gasps, each one more violent than the last, culminating in a sound that was less cough and more choked cry, a desperate final effort. It was the sound of a body failing, of lungs convulsing, of a life struggling against an unseen assailant, fighting for the very air it needed to sustain itself. This particular bout was accompanied by a distinct thud from Hemlock's cottage, a sound that suggested a body falling, or something heavy being knocked over, perhaps a chair or a small table. A moment of chilling silence followed, a silence so profound and absolute that it was more terrifying than any noise that had preceded it. Elara's eyes, despite his best efforts, snapped open. He was not merely awake, he was startled, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. The silence, after the relentless auditory assault, was deafening, a vacuum that screamed volumes, confirming the dread he had been vaguely feeling. He lay there, rigid on his straw palliasse, listening. The rain had subsided to a faint patter on the thatch, a sound that now seemed distant and almost inconsequential. The mournful bells, which had previously announced the passage of so many souls, had quieted, and even the general hum of village chaos seemed to have momentarily abated, perhaps in shared, stunned silence, a collective holding of breath. All that remained was the profound, unsettling quiet from Hemlock's cottage. No more coughs, no more groans, just a heavy, unnatural stillness that weighed upon the air. And then, faintly, undeniably, a new sound began to filter through the wattled walls. A buzzing, a low, persistent, unsettling buzz, like a swarm of particularly large, irritable flies trapped indoors, their wings beating against the confines of a room. And with it, a smell, not the vague, sickly sweetness he had registered earlier, but a thick, cloying, utterly putrid odor, heavy with the stench of something very, very wrong. It was the smell of decay, of flesh already beginning its grim transformation. A smell so potent that it seemed to bypass his nose and lodge directly in the back of his throat, gagging him even as he remained perfectly still, frozen in a horrified awareness. The twinges of unease had now ripened into a full-blown, wrenching dread. His carefully constructed plan, his genius of evasion, felt like a foolish child's game in the face of this tangible, undeniable presence of death. He could feel the cold sweat clinging to his skin, a stark contrast to the rough warmth of the straw beneath him. His stomach, which had previously only grumbled from hunger, now churned with a nauseating mixture of fear and revulsion, bile rising in his throat. He squeezed his eyes shut again, not to sleep, for that was now an impossible luxury, but in a desperate, futile attempt to unsmell, unhear, unfeel the horrifying reality that was pressing in on him from the very next room. But it was too late. The cough, the subsequent terrifying silence, the insidious buzzing, and the overwhelming stench they had ripped open the protective cocoon of his oblivion with brutal efficiency. The plague, which he had so confidently intended to sleep through, had not only arrived uninvited, it had quite literally coughed its way into his waking nightmare, setting up shop right next door, a horrifyingly intimate violation of his planned peace. His mind, now fully engaged and racing, tried to reconcile the stark reality of the present moment with his previous blissful ignorance. How long had he been asleep? What had happened during his grand repose? The silence from Hemlock's cottage was now broken only by that incessant buzzing, growing louder, more urgent, the sound of nature reclaiming its due, of the grim processes of decay beginning their inevitable course. Elara found his hand instinctively reaching for the thin wool blanket, pulling it not for warmth, but as a flimsy, utterly useless shield against the perceived onslaught of the putrid air, a desperate, childlike gesture. He could feel the coarse fibers against his face, a meager barrier against the truth that had permeated his sanctuary. The dark humor of his situation, the profound irony of a man attempting to sleep through a global pandemic, was now utterly lost to him, drowned in a rising tide of terror. All that remained was a cold, creeping horror. The realization that his sanctuary had become a trap, and that the world he had so earnestly wished to ignore had burst through his defenses with a vengeance, demanding his full, terrified attention. The air was heavy, not just with the stench, but with the palpable presence of dread, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed down on him, far more effectively than his own thin blanket ever could. He lay there, utterly awake, his body rigid with a tension that precluded any return to slumber. The image of Hemlock's violent, last cough seared into his mind, an unwelcome and undeniable herald of the horrors that awaited him. The peaceful plan had not just failed, it had been violently, grotesquely shattered by the very reality it sought to avoid. The buzzing continued, a constant, sickening hum, signaling the unholy feast that had begun, a morbid soundtrack to Elara's abrupt, terrifying awakening. His eyes darted around the dark room, seeing nothing, but sensing everything. The cottage felt smaller, colder, no longer a sanctuary but a coffin, and he, its terrified occupant, was now horribly, inescapably awake. The world, it turned out, would not wait. It simply hammered on the door, and then, finding it unlocked, let itself in, cough and all. Chapter 4. The flea that doomed a nap Elara lay rigid on his straw palliasse, his eyes wide open in the oppressive darkness of his cottage. The chilling silence from Old Man Hemlock's cottage next door, broken only by that persistent, unnerving buzz, had replaced the cacophony of the night with a far more potent dread. The stench, too, had deepened, a cloying, sickly sweet odor of decay that seemed to cling to the very fibers of his blanket, to seep into his nostrils and coat the back of his throat. His grand plan of sleeping through the plague, a notion once so elegantly simple and self-serving, now felt like the naive fantasy of a simpleton. He was awake, agonizingly, horribly awake, his mind racing with frantic, unwelcome thoughts, his stomach churning with fear and revulsion. He clutched the thin wool blanket to his nose, a futile attempt to filter the putrid air, a child's desperate defense against an unseen monster. Every fiber of his being screamed for the oblivion he had so recently enjoyed, but sleep, it seemed, was now a luxury irrevocably revoked by the grim realities pressing in from all sides. He could feel the pulse thrumming in his temples, a frantic rhythm that mirrored the buzzing from next door, a grotesque duet of burgeoning horror. It was in this state of heightened, terrified awareness that the true agent of his final, definitive awakening arrived. Not a thundering hoofbeat, not a desperate cry, but something infinitely smaller, utterly insignificant in the grand scheme of things, yet possessed of the power to dismantle the last vestiges of Elara's composure. It was a flea, a tiny, unassuming speck of life, no larger than a poppy seed, yet harboring within its minuscule body the terrifying potential to carry not just an itch, but the very pestilence that had ravaged half the known world. It had likely arrived from the straw. or perhaps from a rat that had scurried through a crack in the wattle, or even more chillingly from the diseased confines of Hemlock's cottage. Carried on some unseen waft of air, a microscopic airborne harbinger of doom. What? Elara felt it first as a faint, almost imperceptible tickle on the underside of his arm, just above the elbow. His skin, already clammy with cold sweat, registered the lightest touch as an amplified sensation. He dismissed it as a stray piece of straw, perhaps, or a bead of sweat tracing a path down his skin. He shifted slightly, a fractional movement, hoping to dislodge the nuisance without truly acknowledging it. But the tickle persisted, a tiny, insistent dance on his flesh, moving, exploring, seeking. It was a sensation of such mundane irritation that it felt almost insulting in the face of the monumental dread that gripped him. He was a man consumed by the stench of death and the fear of an invisible killer. And here was this tiny, impertinent creature demanding his attention with its frivolous movements. Then came the bite. It was a sharp, sudden prick, like a pinprick, but deeper, more insistent, followed immediately by an explosion of itch. Not a gentle, absent-minded itch, but a fierce, targeted assault on his nerve endings. It blossomed outward from the initial point of contact, spreading like wildfire across his skin, demanding a response, an immediate, violent scratching. Elara's arm twitched involuntarily. He squeezed his eyes shut tighter, willing the sensation away, willing himself back into the soothing, if fleeting, oblivion that had been so recently shattered. This was not part of the plague, he tried to reason with himself. This was merely a flea, a common annoyance of peasant life. But the knowledge, raw and terrifying, that fleas carried the plague, was already seared into his panicked mind. He lifted his hand, his fingers already curled into claws, and scratched. A rough, frantic scrape against his rough wool tunic and the skin beneath, a desperate attempt to quell the inferno that had erupted on his arm. The relief was instantaneous, if fleeting, a brief moment of satisfaction before the itch returned, angrier, more widespread than before. He scratched again, harder this time, tearing at the fabric, digging his nails into his own flesh. The small patch of skin grew warm, then hot, a burning sensation that mingled unpleasantly with the prickling itch. He could feel his heart hammering even faster now. Not just from fear of the unseen plague, but from the immediate, overwhelming physical discomfort of this tiny, relentless tormentor. He began to thrash slightly, a desperate, uncoordinated attempt to escape the growing irritation. He rolled onto his back, then his other side, trying to rub his arm against the straw, hoping the coarse fibers would somehow braid the itch away. But the flea, an agile, microscopic acrobat, was not so easily dislodged. It was likely already deeply embedded, feasting, or perhaps it had simply hopped to a new, pristine patch of skin, ready to unleash a fresh wave of agony. Elara imagined it, a tiny, dark silhouette, bloated with his own lifeblood, its legs furiously pumping, its minuscule mouthparts burrowing deeper. The very thought was nauseating. His skin crawled. He felt phantom itches erupting all over his body, a phantom legion of invisible tormentors swarming him. Each one a potential harbinger of the black spots, the swellings, the fever, the agonizing death that awaited those who contracted the pestilence. He tore off his rough wool tunic, tugging it over his head with frantic, uncoordinated movements. The damp, clinging fabric snagged on his arms, adding to his exasperation. He threw it onto the floor, then began furiously scratching his exposed torso, his nails raking his skin, leaving angry red welts. The sensation of the straw against his bare skin, usually a familiar comfort, now felt prickly and menacing, each piece a potential hiding place for another unseen tormentor. He imagined them, these tiny plague-carrying agents, lurking in the straw, waiting to launch their insidious attacks. He could almost feel them, a legion of minute devils, crawling over him, feasting, injecting their poison. The thought was enough to send a full-body shudder through him. He sat up suddenly, a wild, disoriented figure in the dark, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He slapped at his legs, his arms, his chest, anywhere he felt the slightest tingle or prickle. The sounds from outside, which had been momentarily eclipsed by his internal torment, now returned with renewed intensity. The low, sickening buzz from Hemlock's cottage seemed to grow louder, more insistent, a morbid accompaniment to his frenzied self-assault. The stench of decay, too, seemed to thicken, to press in on him, now inextricably linked with the physical discomfort of the flea's bite. It was as if the pestilence itself had finally truly physically laid its claim upon him, not through the abstract fear of distant reports, but through the immediate, undeniable irritation of a single tiny creature. His grand plan, his genius of evasion, had been based on a fundamental miscalculation that the world, even a world in the throes of a devastating plague, would respect his desire for quiet, uninterrupted oblivion. The cough from Hemlock had been a rude awakening, a violent shaking of the cage bars, but the flea, by its very nature, was a far more intimate, far more insidious invasion. It wasn't just a sound or a smell from outside. It was on him, part of him, a constant physical reminder of the vulnerability of his own body, the porous nature of his carefully constructed defenses. He could not sleep through an itch that burned with such malevolent intensity, an itch that whispered of buboes and fever and the cold embrace of death. He continued to scratch, his movements becoming more desperate, more erratic. He ran his hands through his coarse hair, dug at his scalp, rubbed his face against his arms, seeking any form of relief, however fleeting. His eyes, now fully adjusted to the gloom, darted around the small, cramped space. As if searching for an enemy he could see, a tangible foe to confront, instead of this invisible, omnipresent threat. He imagined the flea, wherever it was now, a tiny, dark blob, perhaps gorged and satisfied, now lying in wait, poised for its next terrifying assault. The very air around him seemed to crackle with their imagined presence, a torment of invisible bites and crawling sensations. The dark humor of his situation, the sheer, absurd irony of a peasant attempting to sleep through the Black Death, only to be awakened by a single determined flea, was utterly, completely lost on him. There was no soothing irony in the frantic scratching that tore at his skin. No introspective humor in the terrifying knowledge that this minuscule creature might have sealed his fate. All that remained was raw, unadulterated panic, a deep, primal fear that gnawed at his insides, making his limbs tremble and his teeth clench. He was not just awake, he was electrified, every nerve ending screaming in protest, every muscle tense with a desperate, futile energy. The village outside continued its grim, evolving symphony of despair, perhaps a distant cry, a muted sob, the faint, acrid smell of burning herbs, still attempts at purification. But Elara heard none of it. His world had shrunk to the confines of his own itching, crawling skin, a universe of personal torment utterly dominated by the phantom presence of 1,000 unseen fleas. He stood, or rather knelt, on his straw palliasa, a pathetic, scratching figure in the near darkness, his shirt discarded, his body a map of red welts and desperate claw marks. Sleep, he realized with a horrifying clarity, was no longer merely interrupted. It was banished, permanently. The flea, that tiny, unassuming harbinger, had not just doomed a nap. It had, in its own minuscule way, brought the full, terrifying reality of the plague crashing down upon Elara, rendering him utterly, irrevocably, helplessly awake. His peaceful plan had not only failed, it had spectacularly backfired, leaving him trapped in a nightmare from which there was no longer any escape, not even into the comforting darkness of unconsciousness. The persistent itch, a constant physical reminder of the vulnerability of his own flesh, had become his new personal death Nell. Chapter 5. The village's descent into chaos. Ilara, a figure of pathetic futility in the suffocating darkness of his cottage, knelt on his straw palliasse, arms flailing, nails raking, his skin a road map of inflamed welts and fresh scratches. The Flea, that minute harbinger of doom, had achieved what the death knell, the frenzied screams, and the putrid stench of his neighbor's demise had failed to do. It had irrevocably, agonizingly, physically brought the plague into his personal space. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the low, persistent buzzing that still emanated from Hemlock's silent cottage, a morbid symphony of insect life beginning its grim work. The cloying sweetness of decay, now laced with the acrid tang of his own fear sweat, filled his lungs, a taste of death on his tongue. He was awake, agonizingly so, and the cruel irony of his situation, the man who sought to sleep through an apocalypse, was a bitter, burning sensation in his throat, far worse than any physical discomfort. Yet, even in this heightened state of terror, a stubborn, almost pathological kernel of his initial plan persisted. He still yearned for sleep. He needed it. If only the world would quiet down, just for a moment, he thought. Then perhaps, just perhaps, he could find that blissful oblivion once more. This desperate, illogical hope was now the only anchor in his rapidly unraveling reality. The village outside, having endured the first, shocking wave of the plague's arrival, was now in the throes of its full, terrifying descent into chaos. What had been a series of disjointed, isolated incidents now coalesced into a pervasive, overwhelming wave of madness. Ilara, confined within his flimsy walls, heard it all, amplified by his own desperate need for silence. The mournful, measured tolls of the death knell, which had punctuated the morning, now gave way to a frantic, almost incessant clangor from the church bell, a cacophony of fear, not sorrow. It was the sound of a community unraveling, the desperate plea of a shepherd whose flock was being devoured by unseen wolves. Each rapid clang was a hammer blow to Ilara's skull, shattering any lingering hope of repose. He imagined the bell ringer, likely the usually stoic sacristan, now a wild-eyed figure, pulling the rope with a maniacal frenzy, hoping sheer volume could ward off the invisible killer. The cries from the village square intensified, no longer just isolated shrieks of terror, but a rising chorus of wails, laments, and desperate prayers. He heard the thin, reedy sobs of children, the guttural cries of men, the raw, visceral screams of women witnessing unspeakable horrors. These were not the sounds of individual grief, but the collective agony of a community being ripped apart at its very seams. He pressed his hands over his ears, a child's futile gesture, but the sound seemed to seep through his very bones, vibrating in his chest, making his teeth ache. The air outside his cottage, once merely damp and earthy, now carried a horrifying new symphony of sounds. The frantic bleating of abandoned livestock, their usual herders either dead or fled. The agitated barking of dogs, not in play, but in a panicked, hysterical chorus. The terrified squawking of chickens, startled by the human chaos. A new, far more unsettling sound emerged from the main lane, closer to his cottage. It was the splintering crash of wood, followed by shouts, angry and terrified. Then, the rhythmic thudding of heavy objects being dragged or thrown. Looting, Gandhi. The fragile bonds of community, forged over generations of shared harvests and common hardships, were snapping under the unbearable strain of fear and impending death. Desperate souls, perhaps already resigned to their fate, or simply maddened by terror, were taking what they could from abandoned homes, or even, more chillingly, from homes where the sick lay helpless. Ilara imagined rough hands tearing through meager possessions, the cries of defiance or despair from those too weak to resist, the thud of a heavy chest being overturned, the shattering of earthenware pots, the desperate scrabbling of feet as someone fled with their ill-gotten gains. Each sound was a testament to the swift, brutal collapse of order. And through it all, Elara thought, absurdly, if only they would be quiet. Just for a moment. Just enough for a decent nap. A smell of smoke, which had been a faint acrid undertone from the burning of purification herbs, now grew thick and suffocating. It was no longer just herbs. He could discern the unmistakable scent of burning wood, the dry, resinous smell of timber going up in flames. Was it a desperate attempt to cleanse the air, a mass burning of infected houses? Or was it sheer, wanton destruction, the madness of fear translated into fire? The smoke billowed into his cottage through every crack and crevice, stinging his eyes, making him cough, a dry, ragged hack that felt eerily similar to Hemlock's final struggles. He pulled his blanket even higher, pressing it against his face, trying to filter the putrid air, but the smoke, sharp and choking, seeped through the coarse wool, clinging to his clothes, his hair, his very skin. He could feel his lungs protesting, a tightening in his chest, and an icy finger of dread traced its way down his spine. Was this how it began for him? Not the flea, but the smoke? Then came the frantic chants. From the direction of the church, a chorus of desperate, fervent voices rose and fell, rising in a desperate crescendo, then tapering off into a ragged moan. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. They cried, over and over, their voices hoarse with terror and self-flagellation. Through my fault, through my most grievous fault. It was the sound of religious fervor tipping into hysteria, of souls convinced they were being punished for their sins, abandoning reason for ritual. He imagined the villagers, perhaps kneeling in the mud outside the church, their faces contorted, their bodies racked by a combination of fever and frantic prayer, their voices cracking with despair. The sound was monotonous, yet utterly unnerving, a relentless repetition that seeped into the marrow of his bones, preventing any mental escape. He tried to block it out, tried to force his mind back to the imagined comfort of his straw palliasse. But the desperate litany echoed inside his skull, a grim counterpoint to his own frustrated desires for peace. He heard the distinct clatter of carts, their wheels grinding through the mud, a far more ominous sound than any previously. These were not the wagons of fleeing families, nor the mundane carts of daily commerce. These were the death carts, rolling slowly, relentlessly. Through the village, their drivers, if they were still upright, likely masked with vinegar-soaked cloths, their faces grim, their voices hoarse with the repeated call, "Bring out your dead!" And with that call, a new wave of wails would erupt, followed by the heavy thud of a body, wrapped in a coarse shroud, being hoisted onto the cart. Elara envisioned the heaps of bodies, already swelling and discolored, piled unceremoniously, their grim journey to the mass grave or the pyre. The stench of decay, already so potent, seemed to intensify with each passing cart, a wave of putrefaction washing over his cottage, making his stomach clench. He gagged, a dry, wretched sound, his mouth filling with bitter saliva. He wanted to vomit, to expel the vile reality that was pressing in on him, but there was nothing left in his stomach, only the acrid taste of pure, unadulterated fear. The occasional scream of witch or poisoner would erupt, followed by the sounds of a struggle, a desperate plea, then often a chilling silence, or the roar of a small, vengeful fire. Fear bred suspicion, and suspicion bred violence. Neighbor turned on neighbor, desperate to find a scapegoat for the unseen enemy. It was the sound of humanity at its most base, stripped bare of civility, revealing the raw, panicked beast beneath. Elara shivered, drawing his knees closer to his chest, making himself as small as possible. He imagined the terrified faces, the accusations, the summary judgments, and the thought, morbid and unwelcome, flashed through his mind. What if they came for him? What if his unusual attempt to sleep through it all was perceived not as eccentricity, but as malevolence? What if his very inaction was seen as a sign of dark dealings? The thought spurred a fresh wave of panic, tightening his chest, making his breath shallow. He buried his face further into the straw, the rough, earthy smell a faint comfort against the overwhelming stench of the plague, the smoke, and the rising tide of human madness. He squeezed his eyes shut with such force that tiny pinpricks of light danced behind his eyelids, desperate for the return of that soothing, dreamless dark. But sleep was a distant memory, a cruel mirage. His body was tense, rigid with fear and adrenaline, every nerve ending screaming in protest. His mind, instead of quieting, raced in frantic circles, replaying the sounds of chaos, concocting ever more terrifying scenarios. He was profoundly exhausted, an exhaustion that went beyond mere physical tiredness, an exhaustion of the soul, yet every attempt to find repose was met with violent resistance from his own terrified consciousness. He thought, with a profound and bitter irony that he could not articulate, that this was worse than being awake and fleeing, worse than being awake and fighting. This was being awake and trapped, a silent, helpless witness to the disintegration of his entire world, all while his very essence screamed for the simple mercy of unconsciousness. He yearned for the blissful oblivion he had so recently achieved, that brief, accidental success of his peaceful plan. Now every fiber of his being craved it, a primal need for escape, a desperate plea for the curtain of darkness to fall once more. But the curtain remained stubbornly, cruelly raised. The chaos outside continued its relentless assault, a symphony of human suffering and fear, preventing any form of quiet, any hope of rest. The village was not merely descending, it was plummeting into madness, a whirlpool of despair and desperation. And Ilara, in his small, flimsy cottage, was caught in its turbulent wake irrevocably, miserably awake, clinging to a hope for sleep that diminished with every new scream, every new clang, every fresh wave of putrid air that seeped through his wattle and daub walls. He pressed his face deeper into the straw, his body trembling, not from cold, but from the chilling reality that had utterly shattered his peaceful plan. The dream of sleeping through the plague was now a nightmare of sleepless waking, a torment from which there was no escape, not even in the fleeting comfort of a dream. He lay there, listening, smelling, feeling, utterly consumed by the terrifying symphony of Oakhaven's demise and the futile, burning desire for just one more moment of blessed oblivion. He just wanted to sleep. Oh, how he just wanted to sleep. Chapter 6. The priest, with a grim sermon Ilara, a crumpled, twitching heap on his straw palliasse, remained stubbornly, agonizingly awake. His body, racked by phantom itches and genuine flea bites, trembled with a combination of exhaustion and raw terror. The constant sickening hum from Old Man Hemlock's cottage next door, a buzzing symphony of decay, was now a permanent fixture in his auditory landscape, a gruesome reminder of death's intimate proximity. The air, thick with the cloying sweetness of putrefaction, the acrid tang of fear sweat, and the biting smoke from unseen fires clung to him like a shroud, refusing to be shaken off. His mind, far from finding the sought-after oblivion, raced in frantic circles, a hamster on a wheel of despair, replaying the cacophony of the village's descent. The frantic church bell, the shouts of looters, the desperate chants of the self-flagellating, the grinding creak of the death carts, each one a fresh incision into his already raw nerves. He still clung with the desperate, irrational tenacity of a drowning man to a single flimsy reed, to the idea of sleep. If only, he thought, pressing his raw, scratched cheek into the dusty straw, if only the world would simply be quiet, just for a moment. just enough for a breath of peace, a sliver of that blessed dark. It was a prayer, whispered not to God, but to the indifferent, chaotic universe that was relentlessly unmaking itself just beyond his wattle walls. Then, a new sound began to cut through the din, distinct from the screams, the bells, the rumbling carts. It was a voice, deep and resonant, amplified by the stone walls of the church, carried by a sudden momentary lull in the general pandemonium. It was the voice of Father Alaric, the village priest, a man usually given to long, meandering sermons about the virtues of patience and the proper sowing of crops, delivered in a gentle, droning monotone, designed to lull even the most attentive parishioner into a state of contented spiritual lassitude. But this voice was different. It was imbued with a new, terrifying authority, a timbre of righteous fury and profound despair that vibrated through the very ground. Repent. Father Alaric's voice boomed, echoing across the village square, each syllable cracking like a whip. Repent, you sinners, for the Lord God Almighty has unleashed his terrible wrath upon us. This pestilence, this black death, is not a random affliction. It is the righteous hand of divine judgment, striking down the wicked, scorching the earth with the fire of his fury. Elara flinched, pulling his thin blanket tighter over his ears, a reflexive gesture of annoyance. He wanted to block it out, to simply dismiss it as more of the meaningless noise that kept him from his much-desired rest. What did a priest know of proper sleep? What did fire and brimstone have to do with the comforting oblivion of unconsciousness? His peasant mind, accustomed to the concrete realities of soil and weather, struggled to grasp such abstract pronouncements. But the priest's voice, now a relentless torrent, was not easily ignored. It burrowed into his skull, circumventing his desperate efforts at self-imposed deafness. Look upon your brethren, Alaric roared, his voice laced with a theatrical tremor that sent shivers down Elara's spine. Look upon the dead, piled like refuse in the carts. Look upon the living, their bodies racked by fever and corrupted humors, their skin blackened by the very mark of sin. This is not merely sickness, dear flock. This is the harvest of your transgressions, fornications, avarice, pride, sloth. The word hit Elara like a thrown stone, striking his chest with surprising force. It hung in the air, echoing in his mind, laced with accusation. Was his desire for sleep, his grand, self-serving plan of inaction, a sin? He had never considered it so. It was merely practical, a clever evasion. But Alaric's voice, now tinged with a terrifying condemnation, painted it in a new, horrifying light. He had been trying to avoid God's judgment by literally doing nothing, by being slothful, by shirking his very existence. The thought, unwelcome and unsettling, began to prickle at the edges of his terrified mind, adding a new spiritual layer to his already profound physical discomfort. You have turned your backs on the Lord, Alaric continued, his voice rising to a fever pitch. You have wallowed in earthly pleasures, forgotten your prayers, neglected your duties. And now the Lord has remembered you. He remembers every stolen coin, every lustful glance, every moment of idle gossip, every single wasted breath, every unconfessed sin, every unspoken prayer, every act of selfishness. And for this, he visits upon us this great and terrible plague. Elara's stomach, already churning with fear and nausea, now twisted with a fresh, acidic surge of guilt, unconfessed sins. He had many. Small ones, peasant sins, a few turnips pilfered from a neighbor's field in a lean year, a muttered curse under his breath when his plow snagged, a fleeting impure thought about widow Gunderson's surprisingly ample calves during Sunday service. They seemed trivial in the face of death, mere flecks of dust on the grand tapestry of human vice. But Alaric's sermon rendered them monumental, each one a direct contribution to the unfolding apocalypse. His entire life, a quiet procession of hard labor and simple desires, now felt tainted, a catalogue of overlooked transgressions. And his desire for sleep, that deepest, most selfish desire, seemed the worst sin of all, an attempt to shirk his spiritual responsibilities, to ignore the very hand of God. There is no escape, the priest thundered, his voice reverberating through the village, seeming to penetrate the very wattle and daub of Ilara's cottage walls. No fleeing, no hiding, no barricading your doors, for the Lord's hand reaches everywhere, and the only salvation, the yonling hope, lies in true, profound, and immediate repentance. On your knees, you sinners, beg for his mercy, confess your iniquities, for only through his grace can you hope to be spared the ultimate torment, the eternal damnation of hellfire. Eternal damnation. Hellfire. These were concepts Ilara usually considered distant, abstract, something for city folk and great lords to worry about. His concerns were of rain for the crops, enough bread for winter, and a comfortable, uninterrupted sleep. But now, Alaric's words painted a vivid, terrifying picture of a punishment far worse than the plague itself. The idea of waking from his longed-for sleep, only to find himself in the burning maw of hell, enduring torments far beyond any earthly discomfort, was enough to send a cold, clammy shiver through his entire being. He had wanted to escape death, but what if his escape route led straight into the inferno? His simple, poorly physical motivation for sleep now seemed woefully inadequate, childishly naive. He squeezed his eyes shut again, but instead of the hoped-for darkness, he saw distorted images of bubbling cauldrons and shadowy devils. Images conjured by Alaric's fiery rhetoric. The buzzing from Hemlock's cottage seemed to morph into the buzzing of tormenting flies in hell, and the putrid stench became the very stench of damnation. His own heart, pounding wildly in his chest, felt like the frantic throb of a sinner's soul, already doomed. His carefully cultivated detachment, his peasant's pragmatism that had so readily embraced the idea of simply not being there, was now crumbling under the weight of divine judgment. He hadn't just failed to sleep, he had, according to Alaric, failed in his very soul. Do not be tempted by false comforts. Alaric continued, his voice growing hoarse, yet losing none of its terrifying conviction. Do not think to simply hide away, to turn your back on this divine reckoning. For even in your darkest corners his eye sees. Even in your deepest slumber his judgment reaches. You cannot sleep through God's wrath. This sentence, delivered with an almost personal vehemence, felt as if it were aimed directly at Ilara, an accusation piercing through the flimsy wattle and daub walls of his cottage, straight into his very core. You cannot sleep through God's wrath, the very foundation of his ingenious plan. The bedrock of his simple survival strategy was being systematically dismantled by the priest's sermon. He had convinced himself that inaction was a shield. Alaric was screaming that inaction was a sin, an invitation to eternal torment. The irony, once a dry, comforting companion, now felt like a cruel lash across his face. Ilara's scratching intensified, no longer merely an attempt to relieve an itch, but a frantic, desperate act, as if he could tear the sin from his own skin. He writhed on his straw, his limbs flailing, his breathing ragged. The priest's voice, a relentless, monotonous drone of condemnation, mingled with the screams from the village, the clanging of the death bell, the chaotic shouts of the looters, and the constant, sickening buzz from next door. It was a hellish symphony, each note playing on a different fear, assaulting him from every direction. He had sought quiet and found only cacophony. He had sought oblivion and found only heightened, agonizing awareness. He thought of the small hoard of stale bread and wizened apples, his meager provisions for awakening. How pathetic they seemed now, how utterly useless against the wrath of God. He thought of his quiet, unremarkable life, his simple pleasures of a good harvest and a deep Sunday nap. All of it felt trivial, worthless, tainted by the priest's scathing pronouncements. He was not merely a peasant trying to survive a plague. He was a soul teetering on the precipice of eternal damnation, a man guilty of sloth, of turning his back on God's terrible cleansing fire. Confess, repent, pray. Alaric's voice was now a raw, ragged shriek, pushing himself to the very limits of his voice, as if trying to physically drag his congregation to their knees. For tomorrow may be too late. This very hour, this very moment, the hand of death may already be upon your shoulder, reaching for your unworthy soul. Elara squeezed his eyes shut, wishing, praying, for the first time in earnest, for something other than sleep. He prayed for silence. He prayed for the priest to stop. He prayed for the plague to simply take him quickly, cleanly, without the added torment of spiritual judgment. His physical exhaustion, immense as it was now overshadowed by a profound spiritual dread. The hope of sleep, his initial, foolish genius, seemed a cruel joke, a taunt from a malevolent universe. He had sought to be peacefully absent, but the world, and indeed the heavens, demanded his terrifying presence. He could feel his entire body shaking, not from cold, but from the combined assault of the physical and the spiritual. The straw, once his haven, now felt like a bed of thorns. His thin blanket, once a shield, now felt like a flimsy shroud. He was trapped, utterly and irrevocably trapped, between the horrifying reality of the plague outside and the chilling pronouncements of eternal damnation within his own mind. Sleep, that elusive, tantalizing dream, was now further from his grasp than ever, replaced by a torment far deeper than mere sleeplessness. He lay there listening to the priest's fading, yet still echoing sermon, the words of repentance and wrath burning themselves into his mind, ensuring that even if his body somehow succumbed to exhaustion, his soul would never again find peace. The peasant who sought to sleep through a plague had not only failed horribly, he had been rudely awakened to the terrifying, inescapable reality of both earthly suffering and divine judgment, a twofold torment from which there was no hiding, no escape, and certainly no sleep. The priest's grim sermon had done its work, shaking Elara's very foundation, leaving him more awake, more terrified, and more utterly without hope of rest than ever before. He shuddered, a long drawn-out tremor, the sound of his own desperate breathing loud in his ears, a chilling counterpoint to the distant, fading echo of Alaric's last, terrible pronouncements. Chapter 7. The fevered dreams begin. Elara, a desperate knot of bone and muscle, lay shuddering on his straw palliasse. The priest's final, raw shriek of condemnation, "The hand of death may already be upon your shoulder, reaching for your unworthy soul," echoed in the confines of his mind, intertwining with the ceaseless, infernal buzzing from Hemlock's silent cottage and the pervasive, cloying stench of decay that permeated every breath. His skin still prickled with phantom itches, a legacy of the single infernal flea that had so violently shattered his illusion of peace. Every nerve, ending, screamed. Every muscle was taut with the accumulated tension of terror and exhaustion. He had yearned for sleep with a primal ferocity, a desire that eclipsed even hunger or safety. But sleep had become a cruel, tantalizing mirage, dancing just beyond his reach, replaced by a vigilant, agonizing awareness. He had fought. He had resisted. He had yearned. He had prayed for escape. And then, without warning, his body simply gave out. It wasn't a surrender, not a conscious choice, but a collapse, a brutal cessation of function born of sheer, overwhelming depletion. One moment he was agonizingly, terribly awake, trapped in a waking nightmare. The next, the world simply dissolved into a distorted, swirling void. It was not the deep, dreamless oblivion he had so desperately sought. Oh, no. This was a different kind of darkness, one shot through with flickering, grotesque lights, a landscape painted in the unsettling hues of fever and terror. His body, which had finally surrendered to unconsciousness, was not at rest. It was burning, a heat that emanated from deep within, drying his mouth, making his skin clammy despite the internal furnace. And in this furnace his mind, instead of quieting, began to churn, a macabre mill grinding the grist of his waking fears into surreal, nightmarish visions. First, the sounds. The incessant buzzing from Hemlock's cottage, that vile symphony of decay, became the predominant note. In his dream, it transformed. It was no longer merely the sound of flies. It was the hum of 1,000 tiny voices, whispering secrets, gibbering ancient curses, each one a needle-sharp barb piercing the fabric of his fractured consciousness. The whispering grew, swelling into a chorus, then dissolving into a chaotic, rhythmic drone that echoed the beating of his fevered heart. He tried to swat at it, to bat away the invisible insects, but his limbs were heavy, unresponsive. Trapped beneath an unseen weight, the stench too had followed him into this nightmare realm. The cloying sweetness of rot was now personified, a billowing fog of sickly green that drifted through his dreamscape, smelling of ancient graves and unfulfilled promises, clutching at his throat, suffocating him. He struggled to breathe, his lungs burning, the foul air filling him, becoming a part of him. Then the visions began, at first subtly, like distortions in rippling water. The familiar wattle and daub walls of his cottage melted and flowed, reforming into monstrous, pulsating shapes that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. The straw of his pagliassa became a writhing mass of unseen things, each stalk a tiny, skeletal finger attempting to grasp him, to pull him deeper into a cold, dark earth. He saw faces, grotesque parodies of villagers he knew, their features elongated, distorted by suffering, their mouths agape in silent, horrifying screams. Master Thomas, his skin a mottled purple, floated by, his eyes wide and unseeing. A single, perfectly round pustule throbbing on his forehead, pulsing with an inner light, as if it contained a tiny, malevolent star. The pustules. Oh, the pustules. They became a recurring motif, a grotesque, dancing legion. They detached themselves from the spectral figures that writhed in the smoke-filled air, swelling to the size of apples, then bursting with a wet, sickening pop, spraying forth a viscous, black liquid that tasted, even in his dream, of ashes and despair. These droplets, instead of dissipating, began to coalesce, forming into tiny, grotesque dancers, each one a miniature, grotesque caricature of a peasant, their limbs twitching in an unnatural, jerky rhythm. They danced a macabre jig across the landscape of his mind, their movements punctuated by the low, guttural coughs of old man Hemlock, which, in his dream, had become a musical accompaniment, a bass note in their infernal symphony. He tried to turn away, to shut his eyes even within the dream, but they were everywhere, multiplying with each burst, each pop, until the entire horizon was filled with their twitching, oily forms, a nightmare ballet of disease. And the singing corpses. This was perhaps the most unsettling of all. The slow, grinding creak of the death carts, a sound he had heard so often in his tortured waking hours, now echoed through his fevered mind, accompanied by a chilling, reedy chorus. The corpses, piled high on the phantom carts that rumbled through his dreamscape, were not silent. Their mouths, slack and decaying, opened in unison, emitting a thin, tuneless dirge, a mournful, off-key lament that spoke of lost lives and forgotten dreams. Their eyes, milky and glazed, seemed to follow him, accusing, condemning. He saw them, the faces of those he knew. Old Mother Elspeth, her hair still braided, young Thomas, the cooper's son clutching a wooden toy, even the scrawny village cur, its paws stiff in rigor mortis. All of them singing, their voices thin and ghostly, but unmistakably present, a haunting, ceaseless reminder of the village's grim fate, and his own culpability for his inaction. The lyrics, if one could call them that, were merely repetitions of Father Alaric's sermon. Sloth, sloth, no escape, judgment, judgment. Each spectral voice, thin and reedy, pierced him like an ice shard. He tossed and turned on his actual straw palliasse, his body racked by shivers and heat, his limbs flailing against the imagined horrors. His breath came in ragged gasps, choked by the dream smoke and the phantom stench. He could feel the familiar, rough texture of the wool blanket against his cheek, but in his dream it became a rough, coarse shroud, wrapping him tighter and tighter, threatening to suffocate him. He tried to cry out, to scream, but no sound escaped his throat, only a dry, rasping whisper, lost in the cacophony of the singing corpses and the buzzing pustules. The irony of his situation, which had been a bitter taste in his waking mouth, now became a central, grotesque theme of his fevered nightmare. He, Elara, the man who wanted to sleep through the plague, was being forced to witness it, to experience it, in a form far more vivid and terrifying than any waking reality could conjure. He tried to reason with the dream, to tell the dancing pustules to cease their jig, to tell the singing corpses to be silent, but they merely intensified, their grotesque performance becoming more frenzied, more insistent. The concept of boring bedtime stories was a cruel, distant memory. There was nothing boring here, only a relentless, terrifying spectacle that assaulted every one of his senses. Briefly, he would surface. A gasp for air, a moment of disoriented awareness in the suffocating darkness of his cottage. The actual stench of decay, the actual buzzing of flies from next door, would briefly assert themselves, shockingly real, before his mind, unable to sustain the clarity of consciousness, would plunge him back into the swirling, sickening vortex of his fever dreams. He would scratch at his skin, even in these waking dream moments, tearing at invisible torments, his nails leaving fresh, angry welts on his already ravaged flesh. The heat in his body was immense now, a raging inferno that burned away any hope of true rest. His joints ached, his head throbbed, and his tongue felt thick and swollen in his parched mouth. The dreams continued, relentless, morphing and changing with a terrifying fluidity. He saw Father Alaric, not on the steps of the church, but within his own cottage. His face contorted into a monstrous leer, his robes dissolving into a swarm of plague-carrying fleas, each one biting, while his voice, impossibly loud, thundered, "No sleep! No peace! Only judgment! Only torment!" The familiar landscape of Oakhaven transformed into a quagmire of black putrid mud, each step sinking him deeper, while the sound of the death carts laden with singing corpses circled endlessly overhead, their wheels churning through a sky of bruised purple and festering green. He would run, stumbling through this nightmare landscape, trying to escape the singing, the buzzing, the stench, the burning itch, but there was nowhere to go. Every path led back to a mound of dancing pustules. Every horizon shimmered with the heat of imaginary fires. His attempts to find a peaceful void had been spectacularly derailed. Instead of rest, he found an active, personalized hell, crafted from his deepest fears and the grim realities of the plague. He was trapped in a cycle of torment, waking only to fall back into a deeper, more grotesque version of the horror. His body convulsed, his breath rattled. His eyes twitched beneath closed lids, chasing after phantoms that refused to fade. He was learning, in the most agonizing way possible, that there was no sleeping through a plague, not when it invaded your body, and then, more insidiously, corrupted the very sanctuary of your mind. His grand plan had not only failed to save him, it had condemned him to a waking death, a prolonged, agonizing torment that permeated his every moment, conscious or otherwise. The dreams were no longer just dreams. They were the plague's ultimate weapon, stealing the last refuge of a man who simply wanted to be left alone. And so Ilara continued to burn, to writhe, to scratch, to gasp, lost in a surreal landscape of dancing pustules and singing corpses, perpetually tormented, perpetually awake in the deepest sense, even in the throes of his agonizing, feverish sleep. The illusion of a boring bedtime story had truly vanished, replaced by a personal horror show that Ilara wished, with every fiber of his being, would simply, mercifully end. But the night and the fever stretched on, seemingly without end, promising only more torment, more grotesque visions, and certainly no true rest. Chapter 8. The rat that started it all. Ilara writhed on his straw palliasse, a man adrift on a fevered sea of waking nightmares. His body, a furnace of internal heat, pulsed with an agonizing rhythm that matched the relentless, imagined thrum of flies from Hemlock's silent cottage. The air, thick with the phantom stench of decay and the very real acridity of smoke, clawed at his throat. His skin still burned with phantom itches, each one a memory of the single infernal flea that had sealed his fate and banished the sweet oblivion he so desperately craved. The priest's thundering condemnations echoed in the depths of his mind, intertwining with the screams, the frantic bells, the grinding of death carts, and the spectral, singing chorus of the dead. He was awake, irrevocably, tormentingly awake, his consciousness a raw nerve exposed to every horror, real and imagined. He yearned for the return of that dreamless void, that brief, accidental triumph of exhaustion. He clawed at the straw, at his own skin, desperate for escape from the relentless assault on his senses and his soul. His current reality was a grotesque tapestry woven from fear and fever, a testament to the plague's insidious reach, not just into the body, but into the very fabric of perception. And then, amidst the swirling chaos of his fevered mind, something shifted. The dancing pustules and singing corpses began to recede, not into silence, but into a different kind of vision. The suffocating smoke-filled air parted, revealing not a new torment, but a scene utterly mundane, yet imbued with a chilling retrospective dread. It was a memory, or perhaps a dream of a memory, from weeks, perhaps months before. A time when the whispers of play were but distant rumors, when Oak Haven still hummed with the predictable rhythms of peasant life. It began with the image of a ship, a small, unglamorous cog, rocking gently in the murky waters of a bustling port, miles and weeks distant from Oak Haven. Its timbers groaned, its sails, patched and grimy, flapped idly in a salt-laden breeze. Within its cramped, cargo-filled hold, nestled amongst bales of wool and sacks of grain, lived a creature so utterly unremarkable, so universally reviled, that its existence was barely registered by the human world. A rat. It was a common black rat, no larger than Ilara's outstretched hand, with beady black eyes that reflected no thought, only instinct. Its fur was dull, its tail long and scaly, its whiskers constantly twitching, sampling the air for danger or the promise of a forgotten crumb. It was merely one of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of its kind, living out its squalid existence in the shadowed underbelly of human commerce. This particular rat, however, bore a hidden passenger, an unseen cargo far more potent than any spice or silk. Clinging to its fur, nestled amongst its bristly hairs, were fleas. Dozens of them, tiny, chitinous horrors, their bodies already engorged with the rat's blood, their minuscule guts teeming with a terrifying, microscopic life. They were ordinary fleas, just like the one that had so violently roused Ilara. Yet these particular fleas, fresh from their journey across distant lands, were different. They carried wit. They were the silent, unwitting vectors of the Black Death. The rat, driven by the eternal, uncomplicated urge for sustenance, scampered from the ship's hold onto the creaking dock. It was a dark, wet night, and the port reeked of fish, bilge water, and stale beer. No one saw it. No one cared. It was just a rat, part of the background filth of any busy port. It darted between the legs of a drunken sailor, skirted around a pile of rotting fish guts, and vanished into the labyrinthine alleys of the city, its tiny, unremarkable journey beginning with a single, unhurried scurry. It found its way into a granary, a vast, dusty cavern filled with sacks of grain. An accidental paradise for a creature of its kind. Here, it feasted, it bred, and it spread its unseen burden. Weeks passed, marked only by the slow, inexorable march of trade. A merchant from Oak Haven, a stout, jovial man named Master Barnaby, arrived in the city, seeking grain to replenish his village's stores after a lean winter. He haggled, he bartered, and eventually his wagons were loaded with sacks of barley, destined for Oak Haven's communal granary. Unbeknownst to Barnaby, or anyone else, nestled deep within one of these very sacks, a small family of rats had made their temporary home, seeking warmth and food for their journey. Among them, a descendant of that original, unassuming ship rat, carrying its own population of plague-ridden fleas. The wagon, heavy and slow, creaked its way back along dusty, ancient roads, its cargo swaying gently, carrying not just grain, but the seeds of Oak Haven's destruction. The rats, initially content, grew restless during the long journey, and their fleas, ever hungry, began to explore beyond their immediate hosts. Upon arrival in Oak Haven, the grain sacks were unloaded into the village granary, a squat, medium building near the edge of the common land. But the rats, emboldened by the prospect of a new, abundant food source, scampered out of the sacks, unnoticed. They were just rats, part of the unchanging landscape of village life. They scurried through the granary, a few bolder ones venturing out into the village proper, drawn by the smells of food from cottages, the faint warmth of cooking fires. One particular rat, a lean gray specimen, found its way into the humble cottage of Old Man Hemlock, drawn by the persistent, comforting scent of stale bread and a general musty warmth. Hemlock, an old bachelor, kept a somewhat untidy home, and the rat found plenty to scavenge, plenty of dark corners to nest. It was an ordinary occurrence, a common nuisance, something Hemlock might grumble about, but never truly fear. He would merely set out a trap or curse, and life would continue its predictable rhythm. But this rat was different. Its fleas, having journeyed with it, were now seeking new blood, new hosts. And humans, warm and plentiful, were a tempting target. One such flea, no different from any other flea, no grander, no more malevolent, simply hopped. It left the rat, perhaps in search of a warmer, more hospitable body, perhaps jostled by the rat's sudden movement. It landed, an infinitesimal speck, on the leg of Old Man Hemlock. Hemlock, perhaps half asleep by the fire, merely scratched absently, a common instinctive response to a common irritation. He felt nothing significant, no premonition of doom, just a fleeting itch. The flea, however, had done its work. It had bitten. It had injected. The plague, in that moment, had officially arrived in Oak Haven, not with a roar, not with a visible sign, but with the almost imperceptible prick of a single minuscule insect. For days, nothing. Then, a week, perhaps two, of faint fevers, dismissed as a chill from the damp weather, or a bad stomach from some off food, a quiet cough, a general malaise. These were the subtle, insidious first tendrils of the disease, silently weaving their way through the village, carried from person to person, often by more of those very same fleas, jumping from clothing to straw, from skin to skin. Old Man Hemlock had complained of feeling tired, of a persistent ache in his bones. Then that deep, wet cough began. He had simply gone to bed early one night, a common enough occurrence for an old man. And from there the horror unfolded, leading to the buzzing from his cottage, the putrid smell, the clamor of the death carts, the priest's sermon, and Elara's current, agonizingly sleepless torment. The vision faded, or perhaps Elara merely flailed back into his immediate fevered reality. The dancing pustules and singing corpses returned, more vivid, more relentless than before. But now, interwoven with their grotesque jig, Elara saw the rat, not as a direct, terrifying threat, but as a symbol of the immense, crushing irony of his fate. A single, unremarkable rat, performing its unremarkable rat-like functions, had set in motion the entire chain of events that now held him captive, burning with fever, assaulted by nightmares, his grand plan utterly shattered. The flea that had doomed his nap was merely a tiny, inevitable consequence of that rat's journey, a microscopic ripple from a truly colossal wave of destruction. His entire agonizing ordeal, his sleepless torment, his spiritual dread, the horrifying disintegration of his world, all of it stemmed from something so utterly insignificant, so utterly mundane, that it almost defied belief. It was the ultimate cosmic joke, played upon a man who simply wanted to sleep. And now, even as his fever dreams consumed him, he knew, with a chilling certainty, the true, absurdly simple origin of his suffering. There was no grand conspiracy, no specific divine punishment for his sloth, just the indifferent, relentless spread of something tiny, carried by something smaller still. And the knowledge, instead of bringing comfort, only deepened the terrifying, profound irony of his inescapable, sleepless reality. He was being undone by a flea, carried by a rat which had simply, innocently, been a rat. The simplicity of it was its own unique horror. Chapter 9. The Peasant's Half-Baked Escape Plan. Elara, a mere husk of the man who had so confidently plotted his great sleep, lay prostrate on his straw palliasse, his body a battlefield of fever, phantom itches, and profound exhaustion. The chilling revelation of the rat, that unassuming vector of doom, danced in the periphery of his fevered vision, a constant mocking reminder of the utter absurdity of his plight. The world outside his flimsy cottage had devolved into a maelstrom of screams, frantic bells, and the sickening creak of death carts, each sound a fresh twist of the knife in his overwrought mind. The stench, too, had deepened, a cloying sweetness of rot mingling with the acrid smoke of burning homes and the metallic tang of fear. Sleep, his erstwhile sanctuary, was now a cruel, elusive phantom, replaced by a relentless, agonizing awareness, a perpetual torment of the senses and the soul. He still thrashed occasionally, batting at invisible fleas, his nails raking his already raw skin, a desperate, futile dance against an unseen enemy that had already invaded his very being. He wanted, more than anything, to simply be quietly, to sink into that blessed void. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans for him. It insisted on his terrified, agonizing presence. It was in this state of torturous wakefulness, somewhere between the vivid hallucinations of dancing pustules and the searing reality of his burning skin, that a new thought, sluggish and unformed, began to coagulate in Elara's sleep-addled mind. If he couldn't sleep through it, perhaps he could sleep away from it. The village, this wretched, plague-ridden Oak Haven, was the source of all his torment. The buzzing, the stench, the priest's condemnations, the very fleas that now tormented him, all of it was localized. Indeed, to this cursed plot of earth, logic, rudimentary as it was in his fevered state, dictated a simple solution: leave, flee, find a new place, a quiet place, a place where the air was clean and the ground uncursed. And thing he could finally achieve, that elusive, longed for slumber. The idea shimmered before his eyes like a cool drink on a parched day, a desperate, illogical beacon in the encroaching darkness of his despair. He pushed himself up, groaning, his muscles protesting the sudden movement. His head swam, a dizzying whirl of dark and light, and the stench in the cottage seemed to thicken, pressing down on him, making his gorge rise. He stumbled to his feet, swaying precariously, his legs feeling like stilts made of rotten wood. His vision was blurry, each blink leaving behind shimmering afterimages of dancing pustules. The floor, usually firm and familiar, seemed to undulate beneath his feet. His first goal was his small, battered leather satchel, usually used for carrying tools to the fields. It hung on a peg near the door, a symbol of his mundane, predictable life, now destined for a new, desperate purpose. He reached for it, his hand trembling so violently he missed the peg once, twice, before his fingers finally closed around the rough leather strap. The weight of it felt monumental, as if it were filled with lead, not empty air. What would he need? Food, guides, military, simple necessities for survival. He fumbled towards the small, rough-hewn shelf where he kept his meager provisions. His hand shook as he reached for the stale crust of bread he had set aside for his post-sleep awakening. It was hard, dry, and already tasted like sawdust in his parched mouth. He wrapped it in a scrap of linen, his fingers fumbling with the simple folds, each movement a monumental effort. Next, the wizened apples, shriveled and bruised, but still offering a faint promise of sweetness. He dropped one, then another, the soft thud on the packed earth floor echoing loudly in the oppressive silence of his cottage, a silence only broken by his own ragged breathing and the ever-present infernal buzz from next door. He had to bend down to retrieve them, a Herculean task for his aching, feverish body. His vision swam, a black curtain threatening to descend, and he clung to the rough wall for support, his forehead pressing against the cool, damp wattle. Water. He needed water. He had filled his largest wooden bucket from the well what felt like an eternity ago, a symbol of his preparedness. Now, the thought of the well, possibly poisoned, as Alaric had implied, was enough to make him shudder. But the spring, the distant spring, up the hill, that was safe. He would fill his waterskin from the spring before he left. A waterskin. Where was his waterskin? He vaguely remembered seeing it hanging somewhere, but the details were hazy, lost in the swirling fog of his delirium. He began to shuffle through his few possessions, a pathetic inventory of peasant life. A rusty sickle, a worn-out tunic, a pair of cracked leather boots, all scattered haphazardly on the floor, testament to his previous blissful ignorance. He picked up the sickle, its cold metal surprisingly heavy in his hand, then dropped it with a clang that made him wince. No, not a sickle. He needed food. His eyes, gritty and burning, darted around the room. The darkness pressed in on him, seeming to thicken with every passing moment. He could hear the faint, muffled screams from the village, still rising and falling like a tortured tide, punctuated by the familiar sickening creak of the death carts, a constant reminder of the horror he was attempting to outrun. The stench, too, remained, clinging to his clothing, his hair, filling his mouth with a taste of decay that made him gag. He pressed a hand to his burning forehead, the heat radiating outwards, a fierce furnace consuming his very thought. He felt the phantom itching erupt again, 100 tiny, invisible pinpricks across his skin, urging him to scratch, to tear. He wanted to scream, to lash out at the torment that clung to him, internal and external. He spotted his waterskin hanging from a peg near the small smoky hearth. It was old, cracked leather, but it would hold water. He shuffled towards it, each step an act of immense will. His legs felt like lead, his arms like dead weights. The world tilted around him, and he braced himself against the wall, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He reached out, his fingers fumbling with the stiff leather strap, trying to detach it from the peg. It resisted, stubbornly clinging to its anchor. He tugged, then tugged harder, his whole body straining with the effort. A wave of dizziness washed over him, black spots dancing before his eyes, blurring the outlines of the room, turning the familiar into a churning, formless void. The world was spinning, faster and faster, a terrifying kaleidoscope of black and gray. His hand, still clutching the waterskin, slipped. His knees buckled. He wasn't falling in the dramatic, uncontrolled way of a man stumbling over a root. It was a slow, inexorable descent, a surrender to the overwhelming force of his own exhaustion and fever. His body, having fought so long against the insidious advance of sleep, finally gave out. His eyes, burning and unfocused, rolled back in his head. The waterskin, half detached from its peg, slipped from his numb fingers and landed with a soft, dull thud on the straw beside him. His head hit the packed earth floor with a surprising lack of sound, cushioned by the deep straw. But the impact sent a jolt through his already ravaged skull. He was out. Not truly asleep, not the restful, healing slumber he had so desperately craved, but a sudden violent blackout, an involuntary plunge into a realm beyond waking. His last conscious thought, a fleeting, desperate whisper in the abyss, was of the waterskin, of the spring of the quiet, empty forest. But the plan, half-formed, was already a failure. He had fallen asleep mid-packing, a pathetic, crumpled figure amidst the few, scattered items he had managed to gather. A stale crust of bread, 2 wizened apples, and the empty waterskin lying uselessly beside him. The irony of it, a man fleeing to find sleep, only to be felled by sleep mid-flight, was a cruel, silent joke played by the indifferent universe. His body was still, save for the shallow, rattling breaths that escaped his lips, punctuated by a faint, involuntary snore. But even in this unconscious state, his mind was not at peace. The fever, a raging inferno, continued its relentless work, stoking the fires of his imagination. The dancing pustules and singing corpses returned, not as distant visions, but as pressing, suffocating realities. The buzzing from Hemlock's cottage seemed to grow louder, morphing into a symphony of unseen insects feasting on his very essence, each buzz a tiny drill boring into his brain. The stench of decay, now intensified, permeated his every breath, a physical presence in his lungs, his throat, his very stomach, making him gag even in his unconsciousness. He twitched, a tremor running through his limbs. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound of profound distress, not unlike the whimpering he had heard from Hemlock. The dream, a relentless, grotesque continuation of his previous nightmares, unfolded with terrifying clarity. He was no longer just running from the village. He was running through it, the very mud beneath his feet bubbling with disease, the trees overhead weeping black, viscous tears, the singing corpses, their skeletal fingers outstretched, pursued him relentlessly, their voices echoing Father Alaric's sermon, "Sloth! Sloth! No escape! No escape!" He could feel their cold, spectral breath on his neck, the phantom touch of their decaying hands. The burning itch returned, not localized now, but spreading over his entire body, a tormenting fire that consumed him from within. He clawed at his skin, even in his stupor, leaving fresh, angry red marks on his flesh. A silent testament to the horrors that plagued his internal world. The world outside continued its grim descent, oblivious to the peasant's pathetic, unconscious struggle. The church bell, still ringing with a manic, desperate fervor, provided a jarring soundtrack to the unfolding tragedy. The shouts of looters, the cries of the sick, the creak of the death carts all continued unabated, a symphony of chaos that Alara, in his profound, fevered stupor, could no longer distinguish from the torments of his own mind. He was caught between 2 nightmares, the horrifying reality of the plague-ravaged village, and the equally terrifying self-created hell of his fever dreams. His half-baked escape plan had failed, spectacularly, predictably. He had sought to escape the plague by sleeping, then by fleeing. Now he was trapped by both, pinned by the very exhaustion that had promised salvation, and plunged into a deeper, more agonizing form of sleep, one that offered no rest, only prolonged, surreal torment. The bread, the apples, the waterskin lay uselessly beside him, mocking his last desperate attempt at agency. Elara remained a crumpled, suffering figure, lost in the swirling darkness of his own fever, a man who, in his quest for peace, had found only endless, horrifying wakefulness, even in the depths of his involuntary slumber. The quiet, boring bedtime story had become a screaming, internal odyssey of despair, and the peasant, who simply wanted to sleep through a plague, was now learning, in the most agonizing way possible, that sometimes the only thing worse than being awake is the kind of sleep that offers no escape. Chapter 10. The bargaining phase. Elara lay crumpled on the packed earth floor of his cottage, a figure of profound exhaustion and abject misery, his face pressed against the rough straw of his discarded palliasse. His body, a furnace stoked by the relentless fire of fever, shuddered with tremors that were not from cold, but from the ceaseless internal battle raging within him. The agonizing, relentless itching persisted, 1,000 phantom fleas dancing across his skin. Each prickle a reminder of the one tiny, real harbinger that had shattered his self-imposed oblivion. The sounds of Oakhaven's chaotic descent into plague-ridden despair still filtered through the thin wattle walls. The distant, manic clangor of the church bell, a frantic counterpoint to the slow, sickening creak of the death carts. The shouts of looters, the moans of the dying, the acrid bite of smoke from unseen fires, all swirled together with the cloying sweetness of decay emanating from Old Man Hemlock's cottage, a pervasive stench that clung to his nostrils, coating the back of his throat. He was trapped, utterly and irrevocably, between the horrifying reality outside and the equally terrifying, surreal landscape of his fever dreams, a man condemned to perpetual, agonizing wakefulness even in the throes of involuntary stupor. His last half-baked escape plan, a desperate flight from the village, had ended in this pathetic collapse, leaving him stranded, clutching an empty waterskin, his meager provisions mocking his futile attempt at agency. He yearned, with a raw, primal desperation that surpassed hunger or thirst, for the simple, merciful release of unconsciousness. Just one good night's sleep. That was all he asked. A simple, peasant's desire, now transformed into an impossible, unreachable paradise. A flicker, a moment, perhaps no longer than a single heartbeat, where the swirling chaos of his fevered mind momentarily parted, and a sliver of terrifying lucidity broke through. He was not running through a landscape of black, putrid mud, pursued by singing corpses. He was here in his cottage on the floor, his face half buried in straw, his mouth dry, his body burning. The stench was real. The buzzing from hemlocks was real. The desperate, overwhelming needing for sleep was real. And in that fleeting moment of clarity, a new, desperate idea bloomed, fragile yet insistent, like a lone, determined weed pushing through cracked earth. If he could not outwit it, if he could not flee it, perhaps he could bargain with it. With whom? With God, certainly, for Father Alaric's sermon had hammered home the notion of divine wrath. With fate, that unseen, indifferent spinner of destinies. And with whatever malevolent spirits or unseen forces seemed to be conspiring against his repose. He tried to push himself up, his muscles screaming in protest, but his limbs were heavy, unresponsive, bound by the chains of fever and exhaustion. He could only manage a slight lift of his head, enough to see the dim, bruised light filtering through his tiny window, hinting at an endless gray afternoon. His eyes, burning and gritty, darted around the familiar confines of his cottage, a space that now felt both suffocatingly small and terrifyingly vast. His gaze fell upon a shadow in the corner, a deeper patch of darkness near his meager hearth, and his fevered mind began to work, twisting the mundane into the menacing, the ordinary into the ominous. "Please," he croaked, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, barely audible above his own ragged breathing. "Please, I beg of you, just one good night. That is all I ask." He was addressing the vast, indifferent emptiness, a desperate plea cast into the void. I'll be good. I'll confess all my sins. All of them. Even the turnip from Master Grimshaw's field, and the thought about Widow Gunderson's calves in the third row, during the blessing of the plough. He squeezed his eyes shut, a fresh wave of heat washing over him, making his thoughts swim. The confession was a torrent, a desperate spill of petty transgressions that felt monumental in his terrified state. He promised unending penance, self-flagellation with a birch switch, fasting until his ribs showed through his skin, a lifetime of selfless labor. Anything for the mercy of unconsciousness. A low, soft, bleating sound reached his ears, not from the village, but from somewhere inside his cottage, near the shadow. Ilara's eyes, wide and unfocused, snapped open again. The shadow shifted. It solidified, resolving itself into the indistinct, ghostly outline of a goat. Not a goat from the village, not one of the familiar scrawny creatures that sometimes wandered the lanes. This was a goat of impossible stillness, its eyes glowing with a faint, otherworldly luminescence, its horns impossibly long and gnarled, reaching towards the rafters like twisted branches. It stood there, chewing slowly, deliberately, on what appeared to be a piece of his very own straw palliasse, its jaw moving with a rhythmic, maddening slowness. "You," Ilara rasped. A surge of adrenaline, fueled by fever and desperation, momentarily cutting through his stupor. He instinctively knew this was not a real goat. Or perhaps it was. In his current state, the distinction was meaningless. This creature, solid yet ethereal, silent save for the soft grind of its teeth on straw, felt like an arbiter. You are here, for my sins, for my sloth." He remembered Alaric's sermon, the priest's booming voice echoing in his mind. "Even in your deepest slumber his judgment reaches." Was this the manifestation of that judgment? A demonic goat, sent to deny him peace? "Please," he begged, tears hot and thick, tracing paths through the grime on his cheeks. "Please, kind goat, Master Goat, I will do anything. Anything for sleep. Just 5 hours. From Antelstein, I see it I got go down and man find it morning. And then to Sly. Even 2. I will give you my entire harvest, if I live to see another. My strongest ox. My only good blanket, if you spare me this torment." He gestured feebly towards the blanket, which lay twisted around his legs, providing no warmth or comfort, only a barrier against the putrid air. The goat merely chewed, its luminous eyes fixed on some distant, unseen point, beyond Ilara's fevered gaze, completely indifferent to his suffering, his promises, his desperate pleas. Its rhythmic chewing was a maddening counterpoint to his racing heart, a silent, mocking judgment. "I will never sleep again during the day," he cried, the words tearing from his throat, a desperate, irrational promise. "No more Sunday naps. No more lingering in bed after dawn. I will work from sunup to sundown, even on the Lord's day, if you grant me this mercy. I will build you a shrine of the finest oak. I will sacrifice my last chicken. My neighbor's chicken. Just let me sleep. The absurdity of offering a hallucinated goat, his neighbor's fowl, was lost on him, drowned in the vast ocean of his desperation. He pressed his hands against his burning forehead, trying to clear the swirling images, to bring the goat into sharper focus, but it remained stubbornly indistinct, a shifting, translucent outline, its eyes twin pinpricks of light in the gloom. The sounds from outside chose that moment to surge, a fresh wave of pandemonium. The church bell, now truly frenzied, clanged with a manic, desperate rhythm, as if being struck by 100 hands. A woman's scream, closer this time, sharp and raw with grief, pierced the air, followed by the sickening thud of something heavy hitting the ground. Then the low, guttural murmur of desperate men. The distinct, nauseating smell of burning flesh, thicker than before, wafted through the cracks in the wattle, mingling with the putrid sweetness from Hemlock's cottage, pressing in on him a suffocating blanket of sensory horror. His lungs burned, his eyes watered, and the phantom itching returned with renewed ferocity. 1,000 tiny devils dancing on his skin, all conspiring to deny him the only thing he wanted. Don't you understand? Elara whimpered, his voice now thin and reedy, a child's cry. He lifted his head again, his neck muscles protesting, his eyes pleading with the silent, chewing apparition. It is torment. This sleeplessness. This awareness. I cannot bear it. I will be a good man. A pious man. I will never complain about the weeds again. I will smile at Master Grimshaw even when he cheats me on the yield. I will offer solace to Agnes, Thomas's widow. I will even clean Hemlock's cottage if you just let me rest. He choked on his words, a dry, rattling cough erupting from his throat, a sound eerily similar to his departed neighbor. The coughing fit racked his body, sending fresh spasms of heat and pain through him, making his vision swim once more. The goat, indifferent to his paroxysm of coughing and despair, slowly, deliberately, turned its head. Its luminous eyes, which had been fixed on the empty space beyond Elara, now settled on him, unblinking. It opened its mouth, and instead of a bleat, a low, guttural sound like the deep hum of 1,000 flies emerged. It was the precise infernal buzzing from Hemlock's cottage, amplified, made personal, directed at him. And with it, a faint, sickly sweet aroma, the very essence of decay, seemed to emanate from the goat itself, filling the small cottage with a suffocating putrid wave that made Elara gag. The goat continued to chew, slowly, methodically, the grinding of its unseen teeth echoing the creak of the death carts in his mind. It was a silent, horrifying refusal, a mockery of his desperation. "No," Elara whispered, his voice broken, utterly defeated. "No. Please." He was trembling violently now, a fine tremor that shook his entire body. The raw futility of his situation, the utter impotence of his pleas, washed over him, crushing the last ember of hope. The goat was not a benign arbiter, nor a malevolent demon to be appeased. It was merely a manifestation of his own torment, a cruel trick of his fevered mind, an embodiment of the plague's indifferent, relentless progress. It cared nothing for his promises, his repentance, his agonizing desire for peace. It simply existed, chewing on his very straw, embodying the inescapable reality of his situation. He collapsed back onto the floor, his head hitting the straw with a soft rustle, his body unresponsive to his will. The heat in his body was immense, consuming him, burning away the last vestiges of rational thought. The dreams, briefly held at bay by his desperate bargaining, rushed back in, more vivid, more grotesque than before. The dancing pustules multiplied, their movements more frenzied. The singing corpses chorused Father Alaric's sermon with renewed, horrifying vigor, their voices intertwining with the ceaseless buzzing from the spectral goat. Ilara was sinking, not into restful sleep, but into a deeper, more agonizing delirium, a landscape of personal torment, from which there was no escape, no negotiation, no solace. His ragged breaths grew shallower, punctuated by a dry, rasping cough. The physical world faded, its horrors blending seamlessly with the nightmares of his mind. He continued to twitch, to flail, to scratch at his skin, a pathetic figure lost in a purgatory of his own making. The desperate bargaining had failed. God was silent. Flea was indifferent, and the hallucinated goat was merely a silent, chewing harbinger of his relentless torment. Sleep remained an impossible dream, a cruel joke. He was still awake, fundamentally, terrifyingly awake. Even as his body surrendered to the ravages of fever, his consciousness consumed by the very plague he had tried so desperately, so absurdly to sleep through. The boring bedtime story had become a screaming, endless nightmare. And the peasant, who simply wanted to sleep, found himself further than ever from that elusive, blessed state. The bargaining phase had achieved nothing but a deeper descent into his private fevered hell, each passing moment a fresh, agonizing iteration of his spectacular, horrifying failure. Chapter 11. The smell of death, and also herbs. Ilara lay sprawled on the packed earth of his humble cottage, a pathetic testament to exhaustion, his body a furnace stoked by the unyielding fire of fever. His face, etched with grime and despair, was pressed against the coarse straw of his discarded palliasse, each rough fiber a tiny torment against his inflamed, itching skin. The single, infernal flea, the catalyst for his true awakening, was now merely a memory, but its legacy lived on in the thousand phantom prickles that danced across his flesh, a relentless internal assault. He had yearned for sleep with a primal, animal ferocity, a desire that eclipsed even the gnawing pangs of hunger or the instinct for self-preservation. But sleep, that elusive, tantalizing phantom, remained cruelly beyond his grasp, replaced by a vigilant, agonizing awareness, a perpetual torment of the senses and the soul. He was trapped, utterly and irrevocably, between the horrifying reality of Oakhaven's chaotic descent into plague-ridden despair and the equally terrifying, surreal landscape of his fever dreams. His last desperate escape plan, a half-baked flight from the village, had ended in this ignominious collapse, leaving him stranded, clutching an empty waterskin, his meager provisions mocking his futile attempts at agency. He yearned, with every fiber of his being, for the simple, merciful release of unconsciousness. Just one good night's sleep. That was all he asked. A simple peasant's desire now transformed into an impossible, unreachable paradise. A torment of cosmic proportions inflicted by a world that refused to be ignored. And then it arrived, not with a sound, not with a vision, but with an inescapable, pervasive presence that coated his tongue and burned his lungs. The smell. It had been an insidious, creeping dread, a background note in the symphony of Oakhaven's demise, but now, in his heightened, fevered state, it became the dominant, suffocating reality. It was a duality, a horrifying, contradictory perfume, both cloying and acrid, sweet and sharp, mingling in the air to create a unique, nauseating horror that permeated every breath he took. First, there was the smell of death. It wafted from Old Man Hemlock's cottage next door, a pervasive, putrid sweetness, the unmistakable aroma of flesh beginning its grim transformation, of bodily fluids seeping into the earth, of things left too long unattended. It was heavy, thick, cloying, like overripe fruit left in the sun for days, but with an underlying metallic tang, a coppery hint of blood and decomposition. This scent was no longer just from Hemlock. It was amplified by the slow, sickening creak of the death carts as they continued their grim procession through the village. Their unseen cargo piled high, broadcasting their foul exhalations to every corner. Each gust of wind, instead of bringing fresh air, carried with it new waves of this putrefaction, making his stomach clench, his throat constrict. He imagined it. The very air molecules saturated with the particles of decay, entering his nose, clinging to the delicate membranes, coating his tongue, becoming a part of him, a tangible manifestation of the plague's insidious presence. It was the scent of dissolution, of life breaking down, of a world unraveling into its base components, and it clung to his straw, to his thin blanket, to his very skin, a shroud woven from the breath of the fallen. Then, layered over the sickening sweetness, came the acrid bite of burning herbs. Desperate villagers, clinging to ancient beliefs and futile hopes, had lit countless fires of rosemary, thyme, rue, and whatever other aromatic plants they could scavenge. They burned these herbs not for warmth, but for purification, hoping their sharp, resinous smoke would cleanse the air, ward off the unseen pestilence, and perhaps, by some miracle, turn back the tide of death. The smoke was thick, stinging, a sharp, almost painful contrast to the cloying decay. It scratched at his throat, made his eyes water, and caused his lungs to burn, prompting a dry, hacking cough that rattled his chest. It was the smell of frantic, futile hope, a desperate human effort to fight an invisible enemy with inadequate tools, but it did nothing to mask the underlying stench of death. Instead, the two smells mingled, twisting into a new hybrid horror, a sweet herbal acridity, a nauseating blend of life and decay, hope and despair. It was like a funeral pyre burning with fresh flowers, the perfume of the blossoms rendered grotesque by the underlying stench of cremation. He breathed it in, deeply, unwillingly, and with each inhale, his body rebelled, his stomach heaving with dry, bitter retches. Elara gagged, a hollow, wretched sound that seemed to reverberate in the oppressive silence of his cottage. He clawed at his throat, as if he could physically scrape away the foul air that had become lodged in his very being. His vision, already blurred by fever, shimmered with distorted images of the mingled smoke and effluvia. A grotesque fog that seemed to drift not just outside his window, but inside his very mind. He imagined it entering his body, seeping into his blood, becoming the plague itself, a direct infusion of the pestilence through his every breath. His skin prickled with intensified phantom itches, each one a fiery pinprick, as if the very air was now carrying legions of invisible biting tormentors, or as if the putrid scent was causing his skin to erupt. He yearned for clean air, for the crisp, cool breath of a mountaintop, for the simple, unblemished scent of rain on fresh earth. But there was only this vile, inescapable combination of death and futile purification, a constant reminder of the horror that surrounded him. The constant assault of these smells was a torment beyond description. It made sleep not just difficult, but utterly impossible, a cruel, mocking irony. He was so profoundly exhausted that his body screamed for oblivion, for the sweet release of unconsciousness, for a moment, just one moment, where his senses could rest. But how could he sleep when every breath was a reminder of mortality? How could he find peace when the very air he drew into his lungs tasted of decay and desperation? The smells were an active, malevolent force, refusing to let his mind detach, forcing him into a horrifying, heightened awareness. They pierced through the fog of his fever, through the haze of his delirium, anchoring him firmly to the grim reality that he had so desperately tried to escape. His nostrils, once simply channels for breath, were now conduits for torment. His sense of smell transformed into a constant, agonizing reminder of the plague's omnipresent reach. He tried to pull his thin wool blanket over his nose and mouth, a desperate, futile gesture. But the coarse fabric was already saturated with the omnipresent stench, offering no solace, only a closer, more concentrated dose of the horror. He twisted his head, burying his face deeper into the straw, but the earthy smell, once comforting, now merely mingled with the prevailing putrefaction, making it worse, more intimate, as if the straw itself was decaying beneath him. The buzzing from Hemlock's cottage, which his bargaining had momentarily eclipsed, now returned with renewed vigor. A low, persistent hum that seemed to amplify the olfactory assault, making the air feel alive with unseen, repulsive life. His fevered mind, in its torment, began to play cruel tricks. The smell of burning herbs would briefly intensify, giving him a false hope of purification, a fleeting glimpse of relief. But then, inevitably, the cloying sweetness of decay would surge, overwhelming the herbal notes, asserting its dominance, plunging him back into despair. It was a relentless battle fought within his very nostrils, a sensory tug-of-war that left him nauseated, disoriented, and utterly devoid of peace. He imagined the unseen particles of death and smoke entering his body, mingling with his blood, corrupting his very essence, turning him slowly into one of the singing corpses of his dreams. His lungs burned with each shallow, ragged breath. He gasped for air, for any respite from the putrid cloud that surrounded him, but there was none. The air, it seemed, was the plague's most insidious weapon, a silent, invisible assassin that permeated every space, denying escape even to those who sought to simply breathe through it. He was drowning, not in water, but in the very air, suffocated by the stench of Oakhaven's demise. The need for sleep was monumental, an ache that permeated every bone, every muscle, every thought. Yet the air, the very substance he needed to survive, carried the torment that prevented it. It was a vicious, inescapable cycle, a macabre joke played by a world utterly indifferent to a peasant's simple desire for a quiet nap. Ilara shuddered, a long drawn-out tremor that racked his entire frame. He lay there, twitching, gasping, scratching, his body a battlefield, his mind a landscape of unremitting terror. The smell of death and herbs, that bitter, sweet, acrid mix, was his personal purgatory, sealing him into a wakefulness from which there was no reprieve. He was the peasant who tried to sleep through a plague, and failed horribly, now condemned to experience every agonizing, horrifying breath of it, fully, completely, and without any hope of oblivion. The simple desire for a boring bedtime story had truly curdled into an endless, screaming nightmare, where even the air itself was an instrument of his relentless torment, ensuring that he remained tragically, inescapably awake. Chapter 12. The doctor with the beak mask Ilara lay sprawled on the packed earth of his humble cottage, a pathetic testament to exhaustion, his body a furnace stoked by the unyielding fire of fever. His face, etched with grime and despair, was pressed against the coarse straw of his discarded palliasse, each rough fiber a tiny torment against his inflamed, itching skin. The single, infernal Flea, the catalyst for his true awakening, was now merely a memory. But its legacy lived on in the thousand phantom prickles that danced across his flesh, a relentless internal assault. He had yearned for sleep with a primal animal ferocity, a desire that eclipsed even the gnawing pangs of hunger or the instinct for self-preservation. But sleep, that elusive, tantalizing phantom, remained cruelly beyond his grasp, replaced by a vigilant, agonizing awareness, a perpetual torment of the senses and the soul. He was trapped, utterly and irrevocably, between the horrifying reality of Oakhaven's chaotic descent into plague-ridden despair and the equally terrifying, surreal landscape of his fever dreams. His last desperate escape plan, a half-baked flight from the village, had ended in this ignominious collapse, leaving him stranded, clutching an empty waterskin, his meager provisions mocking his futile attempts at agency. He yearned, with every fiber of his being, for the simple, merciful release of unconsciousness. Just one good night's sleep. That was all he asked. A simple peasant's desire, now transformed into an impossible, unreachable paradise. A torment of cosmic proportions, inflicted by a world that refused to be ignored. The air within his cottage remained a thick, nauseating brew of putrid decay from Hemlock's silent abode next door, and the sharp, acrid smoke of frantically burning herbs from elsewhere in the village. This unique blend of death and desperate futile purification coated his tongue, burned his lungs, and clung to him like a shroud woven from despair. The constant, infernal buzzing from Hemlock's, a symphony of unseen life, seemed to pulse with the throbbing in Elara's temples, a relentless reminder of his intimate proximity to death. His body twitched, his limbs flailed occasionally, batting at unseen terrors, and low, guttural moans escaped his lips, sounds born of a torment too profound for words. He was a man drowning in sensory overload, a prisoner in his own skin, desperately trying to unfeel, unsmell, unhear the world that insisted on his agonizing presence. It was then, cutting through the swirling vortex of his internal and external hell, that a new shadow fell across his door. It was not the shifting, ominous shadows of his fevered dreams, but a presence of undeniable, if terrifying, reality. A series of heavy, measured footsteps approached, crunching on the muddy path outside, distinct from the frantic scurrying of the panicked villagers or the lumbering creak of the death carts. These steps were deliberate, slow, burdened with a grim purpose. A new scent, sharp and medicinal, not of herbs, but of something else. Something metallic and strangely sweet, pierced through the prevailing putrefaction. A scent he vaguely associated with the village healer, but far more intense, far more alarming. A low, guttural clearing of a throat, a dry, rasping sound, echoed from just beyond his threshold. Then, without warning, his flimsy cottage door, which he had long since forgotten to secure, creaked open. The bruised gray light of the perpetually overcast day streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, and silhouetting a figure that seemed to step directly from his most grotesque nightmares. It was a man, tall and impossibly thin, draped head to toe in a long, dark, oil-soaked leather coat that swept the ground like a raven's wings. His head was covered by a wide-brimmed hat, beneath which protruded the most terrifying feature of all, a long, conical beak mask, like that of some monstrous, unholy bird. The eye-holes, round and dark, seemed to bore directly into Elara's soul. Unblinking, devoid of compassion or recognition. Inside the beak, Elara knew, were packed aromatic herbs and sponges soaked in vinegar, meant to filter the pestilential air. But to Elara, it looked like the snout of some mythical, plague-breathing beast. The man carried a long, thin wooden staff, tipped with what appeared to be a piece of iron, which he used to prod the ground before him, and occasionally to push away bodies or to signal villagers to keep their distance. This was the plague doctor. Elara had heard whispers of them, grim figures who appeared in plague-stricken towns, supposedly to bring succor, but often bringing only further despair and a final, terrifying confirmation of impending doom. He was a harbinger, a living embodiment of the very disease Elara had tried so desperately to sleep through. In Elara's fevered state, the doctor was not a man, but a spectral entity, a grim reaper in avian form, come to claim him, or worse, to prolong his agony. He tried to recoil, to pull back into the deepest shadows of his cottage, but his limbs were leaden, unresponsive. His body simply lay there, a twitching, vulnerable mass of flesh, awaiting its fate. The doctor took another slow, deliberate step into the cottage, the iron tip of his staff thudding softly on the packed earth floor. The beak mask, impassive and unreadable, turned, slowly sweeping the small, cluttered room before settling on Elara's prone form. A low, muffled voice, distorted by the layers of leather and herbs within the beak, emanated from the figure. Another one. Found in stupor. Lethargy. A common symptom of the affliction. The voice was detached, clinical, utterly devoid of warmth or empathy, as if he were cataloging a piece of damaged livestock. To Elara, it sounded like a death sentence, delivered by a crow. The doctor raised his staff and, with the practiced precision of a man poking a reluctant animal, prodded Elara's leg. It was not a violent thrust, but a firm investigating poke through the thin fabric of his breeches. Elara flinched, a sharp, involuntary gasp escaping his lips. The sudden physical intrusion, combined with a terrifying presence, sent a fresh wave of panic through him. He tried to scramble away, to push himself upright, but his strength utterly failed him. He merely thrashed weakly, like a fish on dry land, his legs kicking uselessly at the straw. "Aye, the tremors are strong," the doctor murmured, his voice still muffled. "But closer now." He knelt, a surprisingly fluid movement for such a stiffly robed figure. Elara could now see the thick leather gloves that covered the doctor's hands, worn and stained, and the small leather pouch that hung from his belt, filled with an assortment of strange, often gruesome, tools. The smell of the doctor himself, of old leather, stale herbs, and something faintly antiseptic, mingled with the general miasma of the cottage, adding another layer to Elara's sensory torment. The doctor pulled a small, wicked-looking blade from his pouch, its metal glinting dully in the dim light. Elara's eyes widened in terror. Bloodletting. He knew the practice. It was a common remedy, often more fatal than the disease itself. He tried to shake his head, to protest, but his throat was too dry, his tongue too thick. He could only stare, a silent, pleading animal. The doctor, however, ignored his silent plea. He grasped Elara's arm, his gloved fingers surprisingly strong, holding it steady. The blade, surprisingly sharp, made a shallow, swift cut on the inside of Elara's elbow. A thin trickle of dark blood welled up, beating on his skin before slowly, sluggishly, dripping onto the straw. The warm, metallic scent of his own blood joined the other offensive odors in the air. A final, horrifying addition to the olfactory nightmare. The humors must be balanced, the doctor intoned, as if to himself or perhaps to the indifferent air. He then produced a small, grimy poultice wrapped in a piece of stained cloth. It smelled faintly of something Elara recognized as pigeon droppings, mixed with pungent herbs and something else, something vaguely unpleasant and unidentifiable. The doctor pressed this foul-smelling concoction directly onto the cut, securing it with a rough strip of linen. The heat from Elara's skin made the poultice warm, but the stench of it, combined with the still-present decay and smoke, was overwhelming. Elara gagged again, this time a wretched, tearing sound that emptied his stomach of what little bile remained. The doctor then reached for Elara's neck, his gloved fingers prodding beneath his jaw, then under his armpit. Elara flinched, a wave of agony lancing through him as the doctor's fingers pressed on the painful, swollen glands. Bulbous. He felt them. Hard, tender lumps, the unmistakable, terrifying sign of the plague truly taking hold within his own body. His breathing hitched, becoming shallower, more ragged. The doctor, apparently satisfied, nodded slowly, the beak mask bobbing with a grim finality. "The swellings are advanced," the doctor intoned. "A good sign of the humors gathering. We must encourage their expulsion." He then produced a heated iron, a small circular piece of metal attached to a wooden handle. It glowed faintly, a dull red ember in the dim light. Elara's eyes, wide with terror, fixed on it. He knew this remedy too. Cauterization. An attempt to burn out the disease, often leaving agonizing scars and doing little to stop the inevitable. A raw animal scream tore itself from Elara's throat, but it was a dry, rasping sound, barely a whisper compared to the roaring inferno of his own fear. The doctor ignored his futile protest. With practiced efficiency, he pressed the heated iron directly onto one of the large, angry swellings in Elara's armpit. A searing, blinding pain erupted, a white-hot agony that consumed his entire being. The smell of burning flesh, sharp and unmistakable, filled his nostrils, mingling grotesquely with the decay and the herbs, a final torturous addition to his sensory overload. He screamed again, a guttural, choked sound, his body arching, every muscle clenching in agony. The pain was immense, absolute, dwarfing all other torments. He bucked, tried to twist away, but the doctor's grip was surprisingly strong, holding him fast. The sizzling sound of flesh on hot metal was loud in his ears, a horrifying symphony of suffering. The doctor held the iron there for a long moment, an eternity of pure, unadulterated torment, before finally lifting it, leaving behind a smoking, blackened crater on Elara's skin. He then repeated the process on the swelling in Elara's groin, another fresh wave of unimaginable agony, another choked scream, another sizzle of burning flesh. Through it all, the doctor remained impassive, his beak mask unmoving, his muffled voice occasionally intoning clinical observations about the expulsion of humors or the purgation of malign vapors. To Elara, the words were meaningless, drowned out by the roaring pain, the burning stench, and the overwhelming reality that this remedy was yet another torment, another cruel joke played upon him. The pain was so intense that it momentarily eclipsed all other sensations. The phantom itches vanished, consumed by the fiery agony. The buzzing from Hemlock's cottage faded to a distant hum. Even the screams from the village seemed to recede, their chaos replaced by the singular, overwhelming reality of his own suffering. He lay there trembling, whimpering, his body slick with sweat, his mind a raw, open wound. He longed, more than ever, for unconsciousness, for the sweet, merciful release of death, if only to escape this agonizing, prolonged torture. But even that seemed to be denied him. The doctor, satisfied with his gruesome work, dabbed a final vile-smelling poultice onto the cauterized wounds, then slowly, deliberately rose to his feet. He glanced at Elara still, suffering form for a moment, his beady eyes unreadable through the mask. "The humors are now encouraged to flee," he rasped, his voice fading slightly as he turned. "Rest now, the purgation has begun." With that final, utterly ironic pronouncement, the doctor turned and, with the same slow, deliberate steps, exited the cottage, leaving the door ajar, letting in a fresh wave of putrid air and the distant sounds of the dying village. Elara lay there, his body spasming, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The pain from the cauterized wounds was a living, throbbing entity, a fiery torment that consumed his every thought, his every sensation. He had sought sleep to avoid the plague. Now the plague, and its supposed cure, had utterly annihilated any hope of rest. The doctor's visit, far from offering solace, had merely added a fresh, agonizing layer to his suffering, ensuring that his torment was now physical, undeniable, and excruciatingly real. The irony of being told to rest after such a brutal assault was a bitter, burning sensation in his throat, a final, cruel jest from the indifferent universe. Sleep, that longed-for oblivion, was now not just impossible. It felt like a cruel taunt, a distant memory of a peace that would never return. He was beyond exhaustion, beyond despair, condemned to a horrifying, wide-eyed agony, a man truly, terrifyingly awake. Even as his body began its inevitable surrender to the relentless, agonizing progression of the plague. The peasant who tried to sleep through a plague had failed horribly, and now even the promise of unconsciousness was a lie, replaced by the searing reality of his final tormenting wakeful moments. Chapter 13. The peasant's final fitful rest. Elara lay sprawled on the packed earth of his humble cottage, a pathetic twitching heap, his body a battlefield scarred by agony. The searing, blinding pain of the cauterized wounds, two smoldering craters in his armpit and groin, now dominated his every sensation, a living, throbbing entity that consumed his being. It was a torment far greater than the 1,000 phantom itches that still flickered across his skin, a legacy of the infernal flea that had first truly ripped away his oblivion. The air in his cottage remained a thick, nauseating brew, the cloying sweetness of putrid decay from Old Man Hemlock's silent abode next door, mingling sickeningly with the sharp, acrid smoke of frantically burning herbs from elsewhere in the village, and now the metallic tang of his own seared flesh, a final horrifying addition to the olfactory nightmare. His lungs burned with each shallow, ragged breath, his stomach heaved with dry, bitter retches, and his mind, raw and overstimulated, was a relentless churn of feverish visions and the horrifying cacophony of Oakhaven's demise. The frantic, desperate clangor of the church bell, the shouts of looters, the moans of the dying, and the slow, sickening creak of the death carts. He was trapped, utterly and irrevocably, between the brutal reality outside and the equally terrifying, surreal landscape of his fever dreams, a man condemned to perpetual, agonizing wakefulness, even in the throes of involuntary stupor. The plague doctor, a grim, avian silhouette, had just departed, leaving Ilara with the utterly ironic pronouncement to rest now. The purgation has begun. The word was a cruel, mocking whisper on the wind, a taunt from a universe that had relentlessly denied him the very thing he yearned for. And yet, despite the overwhelming agony, despite the relentless assault on his senses, despite the profound, agonizing knowledge that sleep had become an impossible, unreachable paradise, the sheer, crushing weight of Ilara's exhaustion was monumental. It was a fatigue that went beyond mere physical weariness, a soul-deep depletion that screamed for cessation. For a moment, just one moment, of blessed non-existence. His muscles, rigid with tension from prolonged terror and pain, began to tremble uncontrollably. His eyelids, heavy and burning, felt as if they were weighted with lead. His vision, already blurred by fever and tears, swam with dark spots that pulsed in time with the throbbing in his buboes. He was beyond conscious resistance. His body, battered and broken, began its slow, inevitable surrender. It wasn't a peaceful descent, not the gentle drift he had envisioned so long ago, nor the sudden, desperate blackout of his earlier collapse. This was a forced, agonizing plunge, a brutal capitulation where every nerve ending, even as it screamed in pain, yearned for the dark. He shifted, a guttural moan escaping his lips, and curled into a tighter ball on the floor, pressing his face into the rough straw, seeking not comfort, but simply less light, less noise, more. The heat from his fever was immense, a raging inferno consuming his very being, and yet, paradoxically, he felt a profound cold creeping into his extremities, a chill that had nothing to do with the external air. His breath became shallower, more erratic, punctuated by dry, rattling coughs that tore at his throat. He was sinking, not into restful slumber, but into a deeper, more profound delirium, a realm where the lines between reality and nightmare blurred into an indistinguishable, agonizing whole. The sleep that claimed him was a fitful, tormented thing, a mockery of the peace he had sought. His body continued to twitch, to jerk, to writhe against unseen torments. His limbs, heavy as lead, would periodically flail, striking the packed earth floor with dull thuds. His breath, so shallow and ragged when awake, became a symphony of guttural gasps and ragged snores, punctuated by wheezes and wet, desperate coughs that racked his entire frame. This was not restorative sleep. It was a deeper dive into the abyss of his fever dreams, a relentless assault on his psyche. The dancing pustules returned, more vivid, more malevolent than ever before, multiplying with alarming speed, their grotesque forms filling his vision, swaying in a macabre ballet. They pulsed with an internal, sickly green light, each throb mirroring the agonizing pulse in his swollen glands. The singing corpses, their voices thin and reedy, a haunting, off-key chorus wheeled around him in endless circles, their decaying mouths agape, chanting Father Alaric's sermon of condemnation. Sloth! Sloth! No escape! Judgment! 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 Their icy fingers, spectral yet chillingly real, brushed against his skin, leaving a trail of icy dread. The incessant buzzing from Old Man Hemlock's cottage, amplified 1,000-fold in his dream, became a swarm of colossal, venomous flies, each one the size of his fist, their wings beating against his eardrums, their compound eyes, faceted and black, reflecting his terror. They buzzed around the cauterized wounds on his armpit and groin, landing with sickening wet thuds. Their presence an unbearable torment that caused him to whimper even in his profound unconsciousness. The stench, too, permeated his nightmare, thick and suffocating. The cloying sweetness of decay was now a living, breathing entity, a monstrous, formless cloud that enveloped him, seeping into his very pores, coating his tongue, filling his lungs with a vile, putrid essence that choked him. And then, woven into this tapestry of olfactory horror, came the sharp, acrid bite of burning herbs, not as a cleansing force, but as an added torment, a stinging smoke that clawed at his throat and burned his eyes, even behind his closed lids. The combination was a physical presence, a tangible weight pressing down on him, suffocating him, refusing him peace. He would instinctively try to vomit, even in his sleep, his body convulsing with dry heaves that accomplished nothing but further agony. The knowledge of the rat, the tiny, innocent vector of this apocalypse, twisted into a recurring motif in his dreams. Endless rivers of scuttling, beady-eyed rodents, each one carrying a legion of fleas, all converging on his cottage, their tiny claws scratching at the wattle, their whiskers twitching at the wattle. Their whiskers twitching. Their presence a relentless, horrifying tide of an indifferent doom. He was running, always running, through a quagmire of black, putrid mud, each step sinking him deeper, while the singing corpses, the buzzing flies, and the spectral plague doctor with his terrifying beak mask pursued him relentlessly, their forms melting and reforming, their voices a cacophony of condemnation and despair. This rest was no rest at all. It was a prolonged active torment, a descent into a personalized hell crafted from his deepest fears and the brutal realities of the plague. His body, in its feverish state, was reacting, churning, attempting to expel the insidious invader, and these internal battles translated into the external horrors of his dreams. He clawed at his skin, leaving fresh, angry welts tearing at the phantom bites, trying to scratch away the burning, the itching, the very essence of the plague that now coursed through his veins. He groaned, a low, continuous sound, a guttural lament that spoke of profound suffering and utter helplessness. His breath became increasingly shallow, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a painful wheeze. His chest felt constricted, as if an invisible weight pressed down upon his lungs, forcing the air out in ragged gasps. The heat from his fever was unbearable, yet he shivered, his teeth chattering, a profound cold emanating from deep within. And then it happened. Not a sound, not a vision, not an external intrusion, but a violent internal convulsion, a searing, blinding pain, far sharper and more intense than anything he had experienced from the cauterization, erupted in his side, directly beneath his ribs. It was a sudden, agonizing stab, as if a white-hot knife had been plunged into his flesh and twisted. His body arched violently, a sharp, uncontrolled spasm that lifted him off the straw palliasse for a fleeting, excruciating moment. A choked cry, Half scream, half gasp, tore from his throat, raw and desperate. His eyes, already wide beneath closed lids in his dream, snapped open, dilated with shock and agony. He was instantly, brutally wide awake. The dancing pustules, the singing corpses, the buzzing flies, the spectral goat. The terrifying beak-masked doctoral vanished in the face of this singular, overwhelming internal agony. He lay there, rigid, every muscle clenched, his breath rattling in his throat, his body slick with sweat. The pain in his side pulsed, a relentless, burning throb that dwarfed all other sensations, drowning out the sounds of the village, muffling even the pervasive stench of decay and herbs. This was no phantom itch, no imagined terror. This was real. This was the plague. Deep within him, tearing at his very vitals, asserting its dominion over his body with a brutal, undeniable force. He reached a trembling hand to his side, his fingers pressing against the tender skin beneath his ribs. He felt it then, a new lump, distinct from the buboes in his groin and armpit. This was deeper, more internal, a profound, agonizing swelling that resonated with every throb of pain. The splenic bubo, a grim hallmark of the disease, had declared its presence, tearing him from his fevered stupor with a cruel, exquisite precision. His vision, though no longer filled with dancing horrors, was still blurred and dim, the familiar lines of his cottage wavering before his eyes. The air, still thick with the stench of death and herbs, suddenly felt suffocating, each breath a struggle against an invisible weight. The exhaustion was still monumental, a crushing burden that threatened to drag him back into the swirling blackness. But the pain, sharp and unyielding, refused to allow it. He gasped for air, his throat raw, his lungs burning, his chest heaving. He had tried to sleep through the plague, had fought against every external intrusion, only to be brutally, definitively jolted awake by his own failing body, by the very disease he had sought to ignore. The irony of it, a bitter, burning sensation in his throat, was a final, cruel jest from the indifferent universe. He lay there, whimpering, his body consumed by a pain that promised no respite, a wakefulness from which there was no escape. The ultimate failure of his grand plan, the complete annihilation of his simple desire for rest, pressed down on him with the weight of 1,000 stones. Sleep, that longed for oblivion, was now not just impossible. It was a cruel, distant memory of a peace that would never return. He was beyond exhaustion, beyond despair, condemned to a horrifying, wide-eyed agony, a man truly terrifyingly awake, even as his body began its inevitable, agonizing surrender to the relentless progression of the plague. The peasant who tried to sleep through a plague had failed horribly, and now even the promise of unconsciousness was a lie, replaced by the searing reality of his final, tormenting, wakeful moments. He was a prisoner in his own burning flesh, every nerve screaming, every sensation amplified, every breath a testament to his spectacular, agonizing failure. The boring bedtime story had truly curdled into an endless, screaming nightmare, where the only escape was further agony, and the ultimate comfort of oblivion remained forever, cruelly, tantalizingly out of reach. Chapter 14. The Realization and the Rash. Alara lay sprawled on the packed earth of his humble cottage, a pathetic, twitching heap, his body a furnace stoked by the unyielding fire of fever. The searing, blinding pain of the cauterized wounds, two smoldering craters in his armpit and groin, now pulsed with a relentless, fiery rhythm, consuming his being. But it was the new agony, a sudden, agonizing stab that had erupted in his side, directly beneath his ribs, that held him in its brutal, unyielding grip. It was a pain that dwarfed all others, a white-hot knife twisting within him, tearing him from his fevered stupor with a cruel, exquisite precision. His body arched, a raw, choked cry tearing from his throat, and his eyes, dilated with shock and agony, were instantly, brutally wide awake. The dancing pustules, The singing corpses, the buzzing flies, the spectral goat, the terrifying Beak, masked doctor, all vanished in the face of this singular, overwhelming, internal agony. This was no phantom itch, no imagined terror. This was real. The plague deep within him, tearing at his very vitals, asserting its dominion over his body with a brutal, undeniable force. He lay there, rigid, every muscle clenched, his breath rattling in his throat, his body slick with a cold, desperate sweat. The pain in his side pulsed, a relentless, burning throb that drowned out the sounds of the village, muffled even the pervasive stench of decay and herbs. The air in his cottage remained a thick, nauseating brew, the cloying sweetness of putrid decay from old man Hemlock's silent abode next door, mingling sickeningly with the sharp, acrid smoke of frantically burning herbs from elsewhere in the village, and the metallic tang of his own seared flesh, a final, horrifying addition to the olfactory nightmare. His lungs burned with each shallow, ragged gasp, his stomach heaved with dry, bitter retches, and his mind, raw and overstimulated, was a relentless churn of the horrifying cacophony of Oakhaven's demise, the frantic, desperate clangor of the church bell, the shouts of looters, the moans of the dying, and the slow, sickening creak of the death carts. He was trapped, utterly and irrevocably, between the brutal reality outside and the equally terrifying, surreal landscape of his fever. The notion of sleep, that elusive, tantalizing phantom, remained cruelly beyond his grasp, replaced by a vigilant, agonizing awareness, a perpetual torment of the senses and the soul. The peasant who sought to sleep through a plague had failed, comprehensively and spectacularly, and now he was condemned to experience every agonizing, horrifying breath of it, fully, completely, and without any hope of oblivion. His hand, trembling uncontrollably, drifted to his side, his fingers pressing against the tender, hot skin beneath his ribs. The lump was undeniable, hard, and throbbing, a deep, internal swelling that resonated with every throb of pain. The splenic bubo, a grim hallmark of the disease, had declared its presence, a final devastating blow to his stubborn denial. He squeezed his eyes shut, a futile attempt to make it disappear, to rewind time to that moment when he had so confidently pulled his blanket over his head, convinced he could simply miss the entire unpleasantness. How naive he had been, how utterly, tragically foolish. The universe, it seemed, had a particularly dark sense of humor, determined to make him witness every agonizing detail of his failure. He was no longer just suffering. He was suffering with the full, terrifying clarity of absolute certainty. He opened his eyes again, his gaze unfocused, drifting over his own body. The dim, bruised light that filtered through his tiny, grimy window was just enough to illuminate the general outlines of his limbs, which lay scattered haphazardly on the straw. His skin, usually a uniform, if somewhat tanned and grimy, peasant's hue, now seemed to possess a curious, mottled appearance. It was a subtle discoloration at first, almost imperceptible in the gloom. But as his eyes struggled to focus, as his fever-addled brain forced itself to truly see, the horrifying truth began to assert itself. His right arm, extended limply onto the straw, was not merely bruised from his thrashing or scratched from his frantic itching. Not beyond. There, in the inner curve of his forearm, spreading like ink spilled on parchment, were the spots. They were small at first, like tiny bruises, pinpricks of purplish-black just beneath the surface of his skin. But even as he stared, fascinated by a horror that transcended even the agony of his buboes, they seemed to deepen, to coalesce, to bloom into larger, more distinct splotches. They were not merely black. They were a deep Venus purple, almost blue-black, tinged with an ominous, almost sickly green at their edges, like festering wounds. And they were not just on his arm. With a desperate, shuddering breath, He forced his trembling hand to his exposed chest, pulling aside the remnants of his coarse tunic, which lay twisted around his waist. There, on his pale, sweating skin, were more of them, scattered across his ribs, tracing paths up his neck even. He imagined blooming on his face, though he could not see them directly. They were the plague's unmistakable signature, the telltale mark of death, the physical manifestation of the invisible enemy that had already consumed Old Man Hemlock and countless others in Oakhaven. These were the very black spots that villagers had whispered about, the grim, undeniable proof that the pestilence had not just arrived in his village, or in his neighbor's cottage, or on a flea, but had now taken root irrevocably within his very own flesh. A profound cold shock, far deeper than any chill of the approaching evening, washed over him, momentarily eclipsing even the searing pain in his side and the throbbing in his buboes. It was the shock of absolute, undeniable realization. There was no more hope, no more bargaining, no more futile attempts at escape. The plague was not an external force, a distant menace to be slept through or fled from. It was inside him, consuming him, marking him. He was not an observer, not a bystander, but a victim, inextricably bound to the horrifying fate that had befallen his village. The irony of it, a bitter, burning sensation in his throat, was a final, cruel jest from the indifferent universe. He, Elara, the man who believed he could outsmart death by simply closing his eyes, was now branded by death's indelible mark. His breath hitched a dry, rattling gasp, and then broke into a series of wet, desperate coughs, each one tearing at his throat, sending fresh spasms of agony through his side. His body convulsed, heaving with the effort, his head lolling against the straw. The cough tasted of bile and blood, metallic and foul. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the image of the black spots, vivid and terrible, was seared into his mind's eye. He was a canvas of death, his own skin bearing the evidence of his demise. The phrase, "You cannot sleep through God's wrath," uttered by Father Alaric, returned with renewed, horrifying clarity, twisting in his mind. But it was no longer just God's wrath. It was the indifferent biological wrath of a world far too vast and complex for a simple peasant to comprehend, let alone evade. The realization was a heavy blanket, far thicker and more suffocating than his thin wool coverlet, pressing down on him, crushing the last vestiges of his will. Sleep, Bhakti. Oh, how he had craved it, how he had fought for it. It had been his purpose, his strategy, his salvation. Now, with the black spots blooming on his skin, with the searing pain in his side, with the knowledge of the tiny rat and the single infernal flea, he finally understood. Sleep was no longer an option. It was not just difficult, it was utterly, definitively impossible. Not because of the noise, or the smells, or the fear, but because his own body, corrupted and consumed, would not allow it. His body, in its agonizing rebellion, would keep him awake, forcing him to witness every horrifying moment of its own demise. He lay there, trembling uncontrollably, his muscles rigid with tension. The phantom itches which had been a torment now seemed almost insignificant compared to the deep, burning agony of his internal organs. The sounds of the village, once an unbearable cacophony, now seemed to recede, becoming a distant, muffled hum, absorbed by the overwhelming internal screams of his own body. The stench of decay and herbs, though still present, was now less an external assault and more an internal reality, as if the very air inside his lungs was putrid. His world had shrunk, contracting inward until it encompassed only the confines of his own suffering flesh. A private hell from which there was no escape, not even into the comforting darkness of unconsciousness. He tried to move, a futile twitch of his fingers, a pathetic attempt to shift his aching limbs, but his body was failing him. A traitorous vessel succumbing to its invaders. He was pinned, not by ropes or chains, but by the relentless progression of the disease within him, by the sheer overwhelming agony that now consumed him. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, each one a struggle, a fight for a diminishing supply of air in lungs that felt heavy and burning. He squeezed his eyes shut again, not for sleep, but for the futile hope of shutting out the vivid, terrifying image of the black spots, spreading across his own skin, mocking his every desperate attempt to simply be absent. But the image remained, seared into his mind, a perpetual internal brand of his impending doom. The tragic irony was complete. The peasant who tried to sleep through a plague had not only failed horribly, but was now condemned to a heightened, agonizing wakefulness, forced to witness the meticulous, torturous unraveling of his own body, symptom by horrifying symptom. Sleep, that longed-for oblivion, was now not just impossible. It was a cruel, distant memory of a peace that would never return, a taunt from an indifferent universe that insisted on his agonizing presence until the very last breath. He was beyond exhaustion, beyond despair, condemned to a horrifying, wide-eyed agony, a man truly terrifyingly awake, even as his body began its inevitable, agonizing surrender to the relentless progression of the plague. The boring bedtime story had truly curdled into an endless, screaming nightmare, where the only escape was further agony, and the ultimate comfort of oblivion remained forever, cruelly, tantalizingly out of reach. His realization, clear and cold as a winter morning, was that the final, most tormenting phase of his journey had begun, and he would be awake for every agonizing step of it. Chapter 15. The darkly ironic Epiphany. Elara lay sprawled on the packed earth of his humble cottage, a pathetic, twitching heap, his body a furnace stoked by the unyielding fire of fever, the searing, blinding pain of the cauterized wounds. 2 smoldering craters in his armpit and groin now dominated his every sensation, a living, throbbing entity that consumed his being. It was a torment far greater than the 1,000 phantom itches that still flickered across his skin, a legacy of the infernal Flea that had first truly ripped away his oblivion. The air in his cottage remained a thick, nauseating brew, the cloying sweetness of putrid decay from Old Man Hemlock's silent abode next door, mingling sickeningly with the sharp, acrid smoke of frantically burning herbs from elsewhere in the village. And now, the metallic tang of his own seared flesh, a final, horrifying addition to the olfactory nightmare. His lungs burned with each shallow, ragged breath. His stomach heaved with dry, bitter retches, and his mind, raw and overstimulated, was a relentless churn of feverish visions and the horrifying cacophony of Oakhaven's demise. The frantic, desperate clangor of the church bell, the shouts of looters, the moans of the dying, and the slow, sickening creak of the death carts. He was trapped, utterly and irrevocably, between the brutal reality outside and the equally terrifying, surreal landscape of his fever dreams, a man condemned to perpetual, agonizing wakefulness even in the throes of involuntary stupor. The plague doctor, a grim, avian silhouette, had just departed, leaving Elara with the utterly ironic pronouncement to rest now. The purgation has begun. As he now meets, the word was a cruel, mocking whisper on the wind, a taunt from a universe that had relentlessly denied him the very thing he yearned for. The ultimate pain, the splenic bobo, had jolted him awake, tearing him from even the fitful, agonizing sleep of fever. Now he was beyond the fight for unconsciousness. There was no more yearning for a peaceful slumber, no more desperate bargaining with God or a phantom goat. That hope, that singular driving desire, had been utterly consumed by the raging inferno within his body and the stark, undeniable reality of his impending end. His breath, already shallow, became ragged, each gasp a monumental effort that rattled his chest. The pain in his side pulsed with a sickening rhythm, a relentless drumbeat marking the passage of his final agonizing moments. His vision, though no longer a maelstrom of dancing pustules, remained blurred and dim, the familiar outlines of his humble cottage wavering like heat haze, threatening to dissolve entirely. The clammy sweat plastered his coarse tunic to his skin, a cold, repulsive sheen against the burning heat of his fever. And then, as if his body, in its final desperate struggle, had finally allowed his mind a moment of morbid clarity, a strange dark irony descended upon Elara. It was not a soothing thought, nor a comforting one, but a bitter, almost detached realization that settled upon him like a shroud. He saw it all, laid out before him with the stark, brutal clarity of a winter landscape. His plan, his grand ingenious, utterly foolish plan. He, Elara, a simple peasant, had decided the best way to survive a global pestilence, a literal act of divine wrath or an indifferent, unseen force, was to simply sleep through it. He had gathered his stale bread, his wizened apples, filled his bucket with water. He had fluffed his straw, sought out the most insignificant day of the week, Tuesday, and had settled in with a sigh of immense satisfaction, confident in his genius. He remembered that sigh, a breath of profound contentment. How utterly absurd it seemed now. He had sought the epitome of inaction to combat an unstoppable force of nature and disease. It was like trying to outwit a charging bull by closing one's eyes. It was like attempting to escape a flood by burying one's head in the sand. The world, he realized grimly, was not a quiet room you could simply choose to exit. It did not respect your desire for peace, your need for oblivion, or your clever little schemes. It simply was not. And it demanded witness. It demanded participation, even if that participation was merely suffering. Every single attempt he had made to achieve his longed-for sleep had been met with a relentless, almost personal counterattack. The distant baying of a lonely dog had started it. So mundane, so ordinary, yet it had been the first prick in the carefully constructed balloon of his peace. Then the wind whistling through the cracks, a mocking whisper. His own stomach, rumbling with hunger, a betrayal from within. And then, the true cacophony, the terrifying, frantic acceleration of the death knell, no longer a solemn toll, but a frantic, desperate clangor, a soundtrack to Oakhaven's unraveling. The screams. Oh, the screams. They had pierced his thin walls, burrowed into his skull, refusing to be ignored. The shouts of looters, the very disintegration of civility, had underscored his chosen path of oblivious inaction. And then, the smells. The subtle, sickly sweet scent of decay, growing stronger and stronger, then mingling with the acrid smoke of the burning herbs. The air itself had become an instrument of torture, denying him any clean breath, any respite from the putrefaction that heralded death. It coated his tongue, burned his lungs, seeped into his very skin. How could one sleep when every inhale was a gulp of the grave? The cough. Old Man Hemlock's cough. That relentless, wet, racking sound from next door. It had been the sound of life, albeit struggling life, that had refused to fade into the background. And then the terrifying silence that followed it, more terrifying than any noise, a profound stillness that screamed of death's finality. And the buzzing, that constant, infernal, sickening buzz of flies, growing louder and louder, a gruesome serenade to the feasting of decay. He could still hear it now, a low, persistent thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very straw beneath him, from the walls around him, from his own burning flesh. It was the sound of indifference, of nature taking its course, utterly heedless of a peasant's desire for rest. The flea, that single, unassuming, infinitesimally small creature. It had been the final, most cruelly ironic blow. Not a grand army, not a terrifying monster, but a mere flea. It had hopped. It had bitten. And with that tiny prick, the plague had truly physically entered his world, leaving behind a burning, incessant itch that no amount of desperate scratching could relieve. It had rendered sleep not just difficult, but utterly impossible, a relentless physical torment that demanded his complete agonizing awareness. He had tried to escape the plague, and a flea, a creature of such utter insignificance, had ensured his capture. And then the priest, Father Alaric. His thundering condemnations had echoed the inner turmoil, the guilt Ilara hadn't known he harbored. Sloth. His entire plan, his desire for sleep, had been branded a sin, a moral failing that contributed to the very wrath of God. He had sought peace and found only damnation, both earthly and spiritual. The hallucinated goat, that silent, chewing arbiter of his fevered guilt, had merely embodied the world's indifference to his pleas, its refusal to negotiate with a man simply wanting to be left alone. Even his escape plan, his desperate attempt to flee the village for a quieter, uncursed place where he might finally find sleep, had been a pitiful failure. He had fallen asleep mid-packing, felled by the very exhaustion he sought to escape. His meager provisions, the stale bread, the wizened apples, the empty water skin, lay beside him now, monuments to his utter lack of agency. He couldn't even manage to elevate properly. The pain in his side, the new agonizing bubo, was a final, undeniable testament to the plague's triumph. It had invaded his body, then his mind with fever dreams, then his soul with the priest's condemnations, and now, finally, with this visceral, internal agony, it had taken absolute control. There was no more fight left, no more bargaining, no more hope for a restful oblivion. He had sought to sleep through history's worst moments, and history, in its brutal, unyielding reality, had forced him to experience every agonizing, horrifying detail of its unfolding, amplified, personal, and inescapable. He lay there, still twitching, still gasping, the sounds of the village, the smells, the incessant buzzing, all blurring into a single, overwhelming sensory assault. He could feel the cold creeping higher in his limbs, a profound chill despite the raging inferno within. His breath caught, a dry, rattling wheeze that barely moved the air in his lungs. His eyes, fixed on the murky shadows of his cottage ceiling, saw nothing but the accumulated weight of his failure. The grand, dark irony of it all settled upon him with a final, crushing weight. He, Ilara, the peasant who simply wanted to sleep through a plague, was now condemned to a final, profound, and utterly wide-awake understanding of its horror. His unique, ingenious plan had not saved him. It had merely ensured that his suffering would be prolonged, his awareness heightened, and his eventual rest, when it finally came, would be entirely on the plague's terms, not his own. The boring bedtime story had become a screaming, endless nightmare, a personal hell that demanded his full, tormented attention until the very last breath. His eyes, wide and unfocused, blinked slowly, once, then again. The sounds of Oak Haven, the desperate clanging, the distant cries, the creak of the death carts, the hum of the flies, the pervasive stench of death and herbs, all seemed to rush in, overwhelming him, consuming him. The pain in his side flared one last excruciating time. A final, white-hot explosion of agony. A shallow, rattling gasp escaped his lips, a breath that seemed to catch and hold, suspended in the thick, putrid air of the cottage. His body stiffened, a final, violent tremor running through him. And then, with a profound, terrifying stillness that rivaled the silence from Old Man Hemlock's cottage next door, Ilara was quiet. His eyes remained open, fixed on the ceiling, unseeing, yet seeming to bear witness to the bitter, enduring irony of a peasant who tried to sleep through a plague, and failed horribly, right up to the very last moment.